God of Trash, Cultivation LitRPG by Noct. Chapter 179-193. The sharp tap-tap of jackboots sounded close on Rhys's heels as he power-walked away at top speed. "It's you, isn't it? Rhys. I don't know who you're talking about," Rhys rumbled in his best gruff voice. "Fuck. I knew Laurent came by Purple Dawn once or so a year, but I didn't know he lurked around town. No, damn it, that's on me. It's obvious he'd use this city as his base if he was heading to Purple Dawn." Mana rushed toward his back. Rhys dodged, shocked, but it was only a grab for his shoulder, which he easily avoided. "Please, stop. Even if we don't know one another, let me get a good look at your face, and then I'll let you go." Rhys considered, even as he continued to walk away. He had altered his bone structure to be more like Adelise's, both in his body and his face, so it was possible that Laurent might not recognize him if he did stop and let the man look him over. On the other hand, his face wasn't that different. He wasn't skilled enough at Lyra's technique to completely and utterly transform his face into someone else's. The edits he'd made really were a small alteration to his bone structure to make his face more like Adelise's. If he had to say, it probably was a 20% difference from his old face to this one, and the rest of the 80% to get to Adelise came from makeup. The changes his face had undergone throughout the last 3 years of puberty in the mines were equally, if not more, drastic. He was definitely recognizable as Rhys. "Yep. Can't turn around, no matter how much Bright Eyes wants me to." He sped up. Fortunately, he'd been working back of house, so he wasn't wearing his Harlequin gear or his face paint, which meant his disguise and connection with the snack shop wasn't necessarily busted. Unfortunately, he'd been working back of house, so he wasn't wearing his Harlequin gear and face paint, which meant he was definitely recognizable as Rhys. "Please." Rhys power walked around a corner, whipping the turn as tight and sharp as he could. The second he was out of Laurent's sight, he took off at top speed. He couldn't use Trash Step here, but even so, he could use his base strength as a Tier 3 to run faster than most Tier 2 mages. Laurent should just be a Tier 2 mage, so there was no way he'd be able to keep up. A trash can caught his eye. It was meant to act as the teleport point for this shop, but it could work both ways. He dove into it. "I just wanted to say, no matter what, Laurent looked around. The street was empty. The figure he'd been chasing was gone, as if it had been an illusion all along. He sighed. Maybe it had all been in his head, and he'd just been chasing some random person. Their figure had been slightly wrong, and their face hadn't quite been right. But, if he was right, he shook his head. It was a foolish thought. If he was wrong, they were right to run away. If he was right, even more so. No matter what he wanted, he could never go back to those days. But, if only. In a distant city, Rhys popped out of a trash can and ran his hair back, his heart still pumping even if he was well out of danger. He sighed aloud and fell back against the wall, a little shocked at how much that had startled him. He'd been totally taken by surprise, true, but it wasn't as if Laurent had sneak attacked him. The guy was bigger, now, taller, his shoulders broader, but his face, his uniform, and that silly ponytail were exactly the same. Well, that wasn't quite true. Maybe there was a little more braid on his uniform, a few more medals, but it was mostly the same. So much the same, as if no time had passed at all. In fact, for a second, Rhys had felt as though they were still in Purple Dawn, still young, with nothing but a difference in political opinion between them. And yet, so much had happened. While he'd spent 3 years rotting in a mine, Laurent had been up here, in the sun, growing and changing, experiencing the world and living his life. He'd probably had a girlfriend, by now, a real girlfriend, seen lots and lots of the Empire, made new friends and learned new techniques. Eaten good food, skinny dipped at midnight, met strange creatures and read wonderful books. Lived his life. And what had Rhys been doing? Struggling in the mines, risking life and limb to rescue those the Empire Laurent served, willfully oppressed because they weren't convenient for the Empire to acknowledge. Fighting a criminal enterprise the Empire overlooked to maybe take one step toward restoring what the Empire had stolen from those mages he'd rescued. He was stressing over his decisions and spending every living moment awake, working on his plans to destroy the Empire. There had always been a gap between him and Laurent. By now, that gap had to be unassailable. In some other world, in a world where they both spent the last 3 years in the light, growing and laughing, smiling with their loved ones, they might have been friends. But in this world, they were fated to be bitter enemies, and there was nothing Rhys nor Laurent could do to change that. He hadn't thought it would bother him. He hadn't thought it would do anything at all. But, strangely, oddly, seeing Laurent, it had brought it all home to Rhys. What he'd lost, what he'd missed out on, what he couldn't have, at least while the Empire was active, and maybe forever, for the rest of his life. All those things Laurent effortlessly had, safety, security, the peace in knowing his loved ones would be safe, Rhys could not have. It hurt. It stung. Deep in his chest, it ached, pinching and twisting like a knife. He didn't know if it was jealousy or regret, or sorrow for what he had lost, but it hurt. To tell the truth, it was always there. Normally, he didn't feel it, because he actively didn't think about it, but seeing Laurent had driven it all home. How much he was missing out on, and didn't have. How much the Empire had taken from him and everyone else he cared about. He took a deep breath, steeling his resolve. That was exactly why he had to defeat the Empire. Once he defeated them, he could go on living his life the way he wanted to, rather than the way some asshole with too much power and money wanted him to. These 4 years would be nothing but a bad dream, a blink of the eye in his long mage life, and he could forget them as if they'd never happened. He just had to lock in and finish destroying the Empire. But first, he leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. He didn't know how long it would take Laurent to get his chips and leave, or if the guy was still obsessive enough to wait around for hours, but it was probably best if he played it safe and waited for the coast to clear. After that rude reminder, he kind of needed a break, anyways. When he returned, it was dark outside. He'd spent the afternoon wandering the other city, clearing his mind rather than doing anything productive. It had given him the time he needed to reset, and now he was ready to keep moving. Figure out his next big conquest, so he could enable the biggest conquest of all, aka the Empire. He took a deep breath, but before he could get started, Mouse appeared in his line of sight. Rhys barely suppressed the urge to shout and managed to plaster a smile on his face instead. "Damn it, Mouse, you scared the shit out of me. Warn a guy. Are you ready?" she asked. Ready for what? She gave him a look as if it were obvious, a rare move for Mouse. "The ball tonight. You know, the big one in town. The one where we're going to try our first pivotal moment." Rhys blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He'd totally forgotten. Seeing Laurent had completely blown it out of his mind. Did you forget? It's okay. We can." Rhys shook his head. "No. We've been working too hard for this one. We keep going, we don't give up just because I forgot. Though maybe we should back out." With Laurent in town, Rhys shook his head, immediately suppressing the thought. He wasn't afraid of Laurent, and he wasn't going to run because of the guy, either. Laurent probably wasn't even invited to this ball. It was for nobility, not random students. In fact, he was probably safer at the ball than wandering around this town. Laurent was probably on his way to Purple Dawn, and had no time to waste on random endeavors like shitty balls for the annoying nobility. Not that Rhys knew Laurent's opinion on nobles, but a lot of the military students seemed to hold that opinion, from what he'd heard listening in on the snack shacks. About the only ones who didn't were ones who were either nobility themselves, or some distant side family of nobility, who benefited from nobles despite not being a true noble themselves. Then again, Laurent was there with the Empress, when she was conquering Purple Dawn, a little voice whispered in the back of his mind. They usually didn't let random military students hang around the Empress, at least, in his world, that wouldn't happen. Maybe it was different here. The Empress was big on her meritocracy, even if it was rotten to the core and a meritocracy on the surface only. Maybe she'd brought him onto her flagship to drive home to all the nobles how anyone had the right to have an audience with the Empress, as long as they achieved enough. Regardless, there was no way Laurent would show up at the ball. And even if he did, well, Rhys had fully perfected his Adelise disguise by now. He looked more like the red-headed Infernon than he did himself by a mile. If he'd been in full Adelise form, Laurent wouldn't have stood a chance of recognizing him as Rhys. There was absolutely no reason not to go. I'm not missing out. I'm enjoying life in my own way, and helping lots of other people, and doing something meaningful with my life. If anything, it's Laurent who's missing out. So decided, Rhys hurried off to get fixed up for the ball, while Mouse scurried off into her own space to get changed into her servant gear. This really was a big ball, and not just because they'd decided to make it the ball. It was being held by an ally of the Infernons, which made it more likely that an Infernon would appear, which at this point, would be a plus. The ally of the Infernons was highly powerful and influential in this city, and was also highly likely to have an emotional reaction to seeing Adelise's ghost. In fact, it was rumored that the lord of the house holding the ball refused to believe the rumors, and had pledged to destroy the ghost if it dared appear. Not that it would, he'd insisted, because ghosts weren't real, which meant it could only be a miscreant causing trouble for everyone. He wasn't wrong, but it was exactly because he'd made such a bold and absolute statement that Rhys knew he was the perfect target for his pivotal moment. He'd gotten everything all set up, and the moment was ripe. He wasn't going to back out because of some pathetic Tier 2 mage. Wait, did I scan him? Was he actually Tier 2? Rhys thought back, but couldn't recall the answer. He'd been so panicked that he hadn't been thinking clearly, and he certainly couldn't remember what had happened in so much detail. He shook his head. It didn't matter. Laurent had nothing to do with tonight. Tonight, it was time to execute the final blow of his psychological attack, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Least of all Laurent. Lord Estos, the lord holding the ball, had added special precautions to ensure no one undesirable arrived at the ball, such as, for example, Adelise Infernon's ghost, or, according to him, the ne'er-do-well who was masquerading as Adelise Infernon's ghost, whom Rhys firmly condemned, and definitely had no idea who that person could be, if they existed at all. There was a barrier that tracked the number of carriages arriving, and guards wandering the entire perimeter. If anyone entered without a carriage, the barrier would go off, and it would also go off if a carriage the Lord wasn't expecting arrived, or so his hungry guards had bragged at the local snack shop as they waited for their morning energy. Which was why Rhys and Mouse were hunkering on the roof of this carriage, with Mouse using all her might to keep them undetected, unseen, and unknown. The blue arc of the barrier loomed. Rhys scooted a little closer to Mouse, and she reached out and put a hand on his back, her expression tense. She could do this. They both knew it. She'd used her technique to walk through detection barriers before. But Rhys still couldn't help but hold his breath as the blue light flowed over them. Nothing happened. No alarms were raised. They passed through the light, and the carriage rumbled on. Rhys laughed, a little shocked. He patted Mouse on the back. Good job. She lifted her finger to her lips, clearly tense. Rhys nodded back. They weren't out of the woods and into the party yet. They'd only passed the first barrier. The next line of defense was a physical wall with guards patrolling it. The guard at the gate paused and quickly inspected each carriage, then let it through when they confirmed that only the invited guests were present. The inspection was rapidly becoming cursory without the boss around to enforce a close look, but they did peer at the top and bottom of the carriage. Given the level of alertness, Mouse was pretty sure her skill wouldn't work. It required some level of distraction, or at least inattention, according to her, and guards directly looking for Rhys in particular was a step beyond the inattention she could handle. Rhys wasn't so sure about that, but it was Mouse's path and Mouse's skill, so he didn't push too much. As the guard stepped forward to inspect the carriage ahead of them, his attention drifted. Mouse gave the signal, and she and Rhys leapt off the carriage's roof and sprinted for the wall. They ran along the wall, under the line of sight of the guards on top of the wall. Mouse took the lead. Rhys wasn't sure what she was sensing, but she was clearly sensing something, because she kept glancing up every time they passed a guard, but without scanning the horizon so that she would know when a guard was coming up. At last, she paused. Here. Rhys frowned. There was a guard directly over them. What did she mean, here? Barely a moment later, he heard a voice on the other side of the wall. Alois, is that you? Elena, my love, the guard replied. How are you, this beautiful evening? Lonely. Alois, you know the Lord isn't going to come around to this far-flung part of the wall. He's too busy entertaining his guests. Come down. The night is young, and there's so much entertainment to indulge in. Oh Elena, Alois said. A moment later, he laughed and broke his strange, haughty voice. Come on. He'll have my head. He'll never know, she replied, also breaking the poetic voice. Come on. Are you going to leave me down here, all alone, with all these handsome men at the ball? What if my eyes wander? As if they could. But what if they did? Alois, come on. The boss has been working you non-stop. I'm sick of it. I'm finally free of the damned lady tonight, and you can be free of the Lord, if you just show some courage for a split second and come down. Alois hesitated for another moment, then sighed. He vanished from the wall, and there was a heavy thump on the far side of the wall as he landed. I'm going to regret this. Oh, will you? There was a pause. Probably not. She chuckled. Their footsteps quickly faded, and then there was nothing but the sound of crickets and the quiet of the night. Mouse nodded. Let's go. How did you do that? Rhys asked, amazed. Silently, he added, and could you manifest a hot and horny lady for me, if you wanted me to look the other way sufficiently hard? I wouldn't mind, I swear. She blinked at him. I didn't do anything. I just sensed weakness. In the net. It's like a net, everyone's attention, and I'm always looking for a hole through it. I could tell there was a hole here, a weak thread. I could have been wrong, or we could have needed to hit him on the head or something, I don't know, all I knew was that this was an easy place to push things out of place. The hole, everything, I didn't do anything. I didn't even know that was going to happen. I just knew there was a hole waiting to happen here. Huh, Rhys said. He looked at Mouse with a new light in his eyes, and not for the first time, either. A net. She saw other people's perceptions and attention as a net. He'd been imagining it as a vision cone, a la classic stealth games, but clearly Mouse wasn't thinking of it the same way. He desperately wanted to know more, but now wasn't the time. He could quiz her on her path and how she perceived it when they weren't actively in the process of breaking into a lord's house. It'll probably be easier than talking to Desmond, anyways. Just remembering the old man pissed him off a little. If the guy was a ghost, Rhys 100% understood why. He wanted to kill Desmond, and Desmond was actively trying to help him, or something. He wasn't sure if Desmond wanted to help him or not, honestly, or if the guy just got off on being frustrating to young mages. He went to hop up onto the wall, but Mouse lifted a hand. Me first. Makes sense. Stealth unit first. Rhys gestured for her to go ahead. She leapt lightly up to the top of the wall and crouched there, looking around. When she was satisfied, she turned around and gestured Rhys up. He hopped up beside her, and she immediately grabbed his hand and jumped off the wall. They landed softly in the grass. Mouse sprinted for the house's wall, still holding Rhys's hand. A little bemused, he let her drag him to the wall. She turned around. They were going to see us if we, oh, sorry. She dropped his hand at last, snatching her hand back as if she'd been burned. No, it's okay. It's always an honor to hold hands with a pretty girl, Rhys told her honestly. Same, Mouse said, a rare smile breaking out on her face. Rhys blinked at her, then chuckled, glancing down at himself. I guess we're both pretty girls right now. Right. Come on. The hole is closing. We have to keep moving. Mouse sprinted off. She moved silently, every motion calculated to make the minimum sound possible. The effortless way she accomplished it told Rhys that it was unconscious. This was simply a manifestation of her path, one that she didn't even have to consciously activate. I need to hit that level with Trash Step. Rhys followed after her a little more clumsily, since the ground underfoot was good, soft turf covered in an even layer of grass, not trash at all. His footsteps sounded loud compared to Mouse's whisper-soft footfalls, but he knew they were still quiet in the grand scheme of things. He expected Mouse to lead them to the grand entrance, but before they reached it, she stopped abruptly, so suddenly that Rhys almost ran into her. She kicked off the ground and leapt, hopping up to a balcony. Rhys had overrun a few steps, and he backed up and quickly jumped after her. As his foot tapped down on the railing, a guard turned the corner down below. Mouse wasn't kidding, he thought. The hole is closing wasn't nearly urgent enough to convey how close they were to getting caught. He dropped down from the balcony railing before the guards could see him. "Did you see something?" one of the guards asked. "Or not," Rhys amended. "Huh, where?" "Up there. I thought I saw someone jump onto the balcony," the first guard said. Ahead of Rhys, Mouse beelined for the doors into the manor. She tried the handles, but they didn't budge. Locked. She tried again, using her strength this time, but the doors were designed for mages, and they still held. "Isn't it just Eloise and Elena? I'm tired of catching them at it. Let's just let them enjoy the balcony." Rhys pushed her aside. He pulled out a stream of impurities from his core and fed them into the keyhole. The metal corrupted, visibly blackening, cracking, and weakening. He heaved at the handles, and this time, the lock snapped, and the doors popped open. Mouse rushed through. "No, I'm going to go check. Can't be too safe." Rhys lunged through the doors and slammed them shut behind him. On the other side, they stood on a hallway. Ahead of them, an internal balcony pressed out into the large, open room below, looking down on the ballroom. The hallway continued to the left and the right, lapping the room save for the two staircases to it. The doors behind them were glass, and the entire upper walkway was open. There was nowhere to hide. Mouse grabbed his hand for the second time that night. She yanked him a few steps to the right, then lunged behind a tapestry and took him with her. They both pressed up against the wall and held their breath. "One here. Look. It was all in your head," one of the guards said, their voice growing louder as they opened the balcony doors. "Are you sure? Look around. Aren't the balconies meant to be locked?" Rhys tightened his grip on Mouse's hand. If not for her skill, they'd absolutely be detected behind the tapestry. Instead, he could almost see the shadows shifting to hide their presence. Mouse had chosen this tapestry, so the guards would surely look the other way, probably. Hopefully. Probably some noble got annoyed and unlocked it. You know they aren't going to stay locked all night. There was a clang as the balcony doors shut, and the guards' voices retreated. Mouse sighed in relief. Thank goodness. Rhys glanced down. You can let go now, you know. Oh, right. Mouse, dare he say, reluctantly, released his hand. She giggled and looked aside. Sorry. No need to apologize. Rhys glanced around. Should we, stay here until the party starts? Mouse hesitated, then slowly nodded. That's probably best. Rhys twisted his lips. Oh well. He pulled out the red book and started reading it again. He'd found it far more illuminating since talking to Desmond, though partially because it was less frustrating than the man. He didn't notice, but Mouse stared at him for a few long moments, something almost like hope on her face, then quickly looked away, looking at her feet instead. She sighed silently and closed her eyes. And slowly, down below, the dance floor filled. Rhys yawned, then finally lowered his book. By the volume alone, the ball was well and truly going by now, not to mention the smell of delicious food and the delicate music wafting on the breeze. He nodded at Mouse. Shall we? And now? Just like that? She asked, startled. Rhys blinked. Yeah, the ball's going. We can slide into the guests without being noticed. No need to hold out any longer. Oh, yes, right. For some reason, a blush crept up her neck and onto her cheeks. She nodded, turning away to hide it. Let's get going. He frowned at her, then shrugged. Gods only knew what she thought he'd meant. Luckily, he wasn't the sort of uncouth youth who'd trouble a lady with anything untoward, so there was no need for Mouse to worry. Rhys glanced out from the edge of the tapestry, then, seeing that the coast was clear, stepped out boldly onto the upper walkway. There were a few couples up here, but they were busy talking or otherwise dallying, and didn't give him too close of a look. He looked around, then smiled and reached into his sleeve, drawing out a veiled mask. Lord Estos was so particular about this ball and its security for one simple reason. This was his yearly masquerade, and he refused to compromise on mask wearing. Instead, he'd installed his over-the-top security system, so that everyone could confidently, comfortably, wear masks and flirt with anyone they pleased, without caring over much for their pair's name, surname, rank, or anything else. There'd been rumors that he might call of the ball, or rescind the masquerade, but Lord Estos refused. It had been his tradition for decades to hold a masquerade, and some make-believe ghost wasn't going to change that. And so, Rhys wore midnight blue robes tailored to show off his new-ish Adelise Infernon figure, with layered, voluminous sleeves, silver chains, and tiny four-pointed star-shaped silver decorations all over it. If anyone looked too closely, they might realize that the star decorations were just broken pins he'd pulled out of the garbage and folded over to make a cheap staple, or noticed that the chains were actually the kind meant for holding small cauldrons over a fire, stripped of their impurities so that they shone despite being made of cheap metal. But Rhys didn't think anyone else here had made their own clothes, so he wasn't too worried. His mask covered his eyes in dark blue with silver detailing and small silver stars, with a gauzy dark blue veil covering his lower face that was itself studded with silver foil stars which he definitely hadn't cut out of the metal linings he usually used for chip bags. It was a pretty sweet outfit, if he said so himself, and perfectly met his requirements. Not so flashy that it stood out or drew the eye, but refined and attractive enough that no one would look twice or consider him out of place. Mouse wore a new rendition of the servant's outfit. He changed it up mostly so that people wouldn't lock on to the same servant showing up everywhere. True, Mouse's skill probably prevented anyone from noticing, but it didn't hurt to add a little practical effect to the magic GI. Plus, he liked putting Mouse in cute new outfits. It was just like making his female friend back home nice clothes, except Mouse was a little bit cuter when she wasn't trying her best to be invisible. It wasn't his friend's fault. Mouse was a mage, and mages auto-unlocked attractiveness the higher their rank climbed. Even he was hot, and that was certainly no fault of his. In any case, he'd dressed Mouse to match. He'd been tempted to put her in all silver, but given that he didn't have silver lame and wasn't interested in making it, either, he'd nixed that idea. It was probably too flashy, anyways, but oh so tempting to have a servant who also served as an accentuating accessory. In any case, he'd gone with the same midnight blue for her outfit, with a four-pointed star brooch on her left chest connected to a drapery of chains that dangled over her right arm. For practicality's sake, he'd constructed it so that the chains would snap off the brooch at the first sign of combat. No matter how loose he made the chains, he knew from experience that anything that draped to the elbow would snag in quick motions, so best for the brooch to break rather than the chains restrict her motion in battle. At Mouse's request, he'd given her loose robes with a flowing skirt, which would also be easy to move in. His own robes hugged the hips but were loose at the bottom, which meant he was one kick away from having completely free hips and legs. Aside from that, there wasn't much to write home about with Mouse's outfit. Her mask, too, was plain and dark, but that was in line with the other servants'. Honestly, even the brooch might have been a bit much for a servant's uniform if this wasn't a fancy dress masquerade. Still, it was a step up from the generic austere but nice robes he'd had to make for her until now, so he couldn't complain too much. Most of the servants were making themselves scarce along the edges or assisting their noble in particular. It was a bit odd that Rhys, or rather, Adelise's, servant followed along at her elbow, always by her side. Fortunately, Mouse's aura of invisibility was enough to mask that, and no one so much as spared her a second glance. The two of them descended the stairs and entered the party, smoothly sliding into the crowd with Mouse's quiet assistance. Rhys eyed the buffet table, but held himself back for now. Adelise's ghost was starting to get a reputation as a hungry ghost, and he wasn't sure if that made a whole lot of sense for the havoc he intended on causing tonight. He scanned the crowd for white-haired white-uniformed tampon boys, but he didn't see his adversary. He had to keep his guard up, though. Laurent had recognized him, maybe. Thought he saw Rhys, but couldn't confirm it, at best. Given that the combined might of the Empire hadn't yet come down on his head, he was pretty sure Laurent hadn't reported him. What was there to report, if he thought about it? That Laurent thought he might have seen someone who had escaped from a camp. If he were Laurent, he'd want to be sure that he'd actually seen an escapee before he went around reporting things. Plus, wait, hold on. He called me Rena, and Rhys. So he thought I was Rena, maybe. But he knows Rena is Rhys. Or suspects it, anyways. And I was in boy form, even if I fucked with my bones, so, why? A horrible possibility occurred to him, and Rhys pressed his lips together, a little scared it was true. Did Laurent, maybe, possibly, think Rena was the real one, and Rhys was the costume? Or, did he live in some mysterious world where Rena and Rhys were separate, but simply shared so many physical characteristics that it was acceptable for him to mistake one for the other? If that was the case, then maybe he didn't even know for sure that he had to report what he'd seen, since Rena hadn't been captured and therefore could possibly be visiting the Empire legitimately, but for some reason, had chosen to crossdress. Which was a weird thing to do, but Rhys was doing it right now, so he couldn't exactly throw stones at any of Laurent's possible crossdressing related theories. His head hurt just thinking about it. Scowling, he rubbed his forehead. Damn you, Laurent. Be confused in a less confusing way. But it didn't look like Laurent was here, so he could put that problem to the back of his mind once again and focus on the most important part of the evening. Rhys, here, Mouse whispered, materializing at his side with a plate of food. Rhys gratefully accepted her offering, continuing to watch over the crowd. It was still early in the evening, and while the musicians were doing their best, only a few people were dancing. Most people hung around the periphery, gossiping and chatting about the latest and greatest happenings around the Empire. He listened in, but only half-heartedly. Today, he wasn't here to listen. He was here to make gossip, in the worst possible way. No one had paid him any attention while Mouse had made her first snack run, so when Rhys finished off his plate, he handed it back to her. Could you get some more of those chicken bites? And I think I just saw them bring out a charcuterie platter, I'd kill for an olive and some good cheese. Mouse nodded and took his plate. Are you sure you don't want anything? I feel bad making you fetch food for me, Rhys said, looking at her. A little bad, but not bad enough to not ask her to go get food. It was better than him attracting attention by getting food himself, and he wasn't the kind of self-sacrificing, too polite idiot who was afraid to take advantage of an advantage freely offered. She shook her head. This is training for me. I want to stay focused. Rhys nodded. Made sense to him. He wasn't about to tell anyone to stop training, least of all Mouse, who he never saw training. Though now that he actually thought about that, it made a whole lot of sense. If he saw the stealth mage training, she probably wasn't a very good stealth mage, huh? She vanished, leaving him all alone once more. Rhys stood quietly by a pillar, keeping his ears and eyes open. Most of the gossip was useless to him. Doria was having another child, which made her 24th. Apparently this was considered a bit much even for a 500-year-old woman who could continue to have children forever. He wasn't quite sure, but he got the feeling that some people were jealous of her, since apparently most mages had trouble conceiving past a certain tier. Joke was on a quest to find a mythical sword which most people considered actual myth and not merely a real and powerful artifact. This wasn't his first time questing after false myths, and quite a few people were hoping he settled down and started trying for real power soon, so he wouldn't fall behind the rest of his family. Most myths were considered reasonable to chase, but not this one, something about it being a mortal myth, not a real myth. Talik was still searching for her path, like always, getting distracted by every new trend that flashed by. Her parents were worried she wouldn't find it in time to grow to tier 4, which would weaken her for good, but most of the mages thought that she'd either find it in time, or her parents would force her to take their path, Something that would make her weaker in the long run, but wouldn't lock her out of Tier 5 the way growing to Tier 4 without one would. Honestly, he was learning a lot about mage society just standing around listening to idle noble gossip. He felt like he maybe should have learned some of this by now, but better late than never. Besides, Trash wasn't well educated. Being poorly educated was part of his path. That's my excuse, anyways. Really, I just couldn't be asked to sit around in boring classes. He had to admit that it was looking less like a fantastic idea and more like a personal failing these days, but what was he supposed to do? Sit through more required learning. After a lifetime of required learning, required training, and more required training. He'd rather die. No, he had died. Died for his sins, and had no desire to acquire any more training-related sins for now. The music swelled, and couples populated the dance floor. Rhys leaned against the pillar, wishing he had something to sip. Servants wandered the hall, holding trays with delicate flutes of champagne atop them. He eyed the cups longingly. I'll have Mouse grab one of those next. It'll be good training, grabbing something from someone who's actively protecting it. Not that they were really protecting the drinks, but when it came to training, the principle was the same. Excuse me, milady, could I have this dance? This is what I get for sending Mouse away. Sighing internally, Rhys turned to find a tall, handsome man with his hand outstretched. He wore an elaborate costume in red, with a mask that covered most of his face, but the straight white ponytail was a dead giveaway. He froze. Oh, shit. A second before he panicked, Rhys took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. It was okay. He was in disguise and wearing a mask. Laurent hadn't necessarily recognized him. He was just the average man, looking for a lady to dance with. He'd seen someone on the edge of the ball with no partner, and decided to take his chances, or thought he was offering charity, which honestly seemed more likely to Rhys, given Laurent's personality and general aura of do-goodiness. There was no way he could recognize Rhys through the bone changes, the veil, and the mask. Hell, no one had even recognized Adelise Infernon, yet, thanks to his masterful costuming skills, aka a thick, dark veil over his red wig. And based on Laurent's bearing and expression, what little he could see through the mask, the man hadn't recognized him as Rhys or Rena. He had nothing to worry about. In which case, he now had to consider how a woman of his apparent age and tier would react to getting offered a dance by a handsome stranger. He quietly scanned Laurent, and his brows raised. Tier 3, now, the same as him. Someone had moved up in the world. But that made it harder to refuse him. A Tier 3 lady refusing a Tier 2 man was simply expected. Two Tier 3s, on the other hand. He wasn't sure he'd seen any same-tier refusals. He would stand out if he refused Laurent like this, without a good excuse to refuse him. Biting his lip, Rhys thought for a moment, but there really was nothing. The masks meant he couldn't stand on his supposed noble status. He wouldn't know Laurent was a military man if he hadn't immediately recognized the guy. For that matter, now that he was thinking about it, it wasn't as if he knew that Laurent wasn't a noble. Well, he said he was of common birth, I guess, didn't he? But how common is common? Depending on his perspective, he might see himself as common birth, if he was only a minor noble, as opposed to a duke or something. Either way, the masks removed that wrinkle. He didn't want to stand out, and Mouse wasn't around to smooth over any social faux pas he made, so he pasted a smile on his face and delicately placed his hand in Laurent's, the way he'd seen the other ladies do it. It was just one dance, after all. One dance, and then he could scurry back to the pillar and go back to being invisible. I'd be honored. Their hands met. As palm met palm, Rhys suddenly remembered something. At the tournament, they'd shook hands, and in that moment, Laurent had. Laurent's grip on his hand tightened. Behind his mask, the man's eyes flashed. Too late. Rhys sighed aloud, since there was no reason to keep it internal this time. Why are we all wearing masks, anyways? Everyone knows who everyone is. There's no point. Laurent pulled him in close. His grip was like iron, as if he was afraid to let Rhys, or rather, Rena, go. It's you. I knew it. Well, there's one last thing to fall back on. The artifice that none of us know who one another is. Rhys blinked, as if in shock. I'm afraid I don't recall you. Please release me. It's me. Laurent, the man quickly introduced himself. God's damn it. Rhys sighed again. He looked at Laurent, a dark look in his eyes. So what do you want? It was Laurent's turn to blink, as though he didn't understand why Rhys might be upset. A dance. Wait, are we actually living in the land where Rena escaped the Empire, then happened to choose to come back here to set up a snack shack? But, he looked at his hand. If his suspicions from the tournament were true, then Laurent knew Rhys and Rena were one and the same. He could still be deluding himself about which one was the base form, but he couldn't be deluding himself about Rena not being in the same exact bad situation Rhys was in. He frowned at Laurent. Is that really all? He remembered the guy as being a pretty formal, rules-following type, who had invited students from another school onto his warship, in violation of all rules and formality. Maybe he's not as hung up on rules as I thought, or at least, willing to look aside when there's pussy on the line. Which meant, if that was true, then he desperately needed to cling to Rena as the true self, because the second Laurent found out there was, in fact, no pussy on the line, he'd be in deep shit. In more ways than one. In conclusion, Laurent knew he was Rhys, and Rena, and that he was on the run, but maybe didn't care because he thought Rhys was Rena, rather than the other way around, and wanted to get in Rena's pants. Who knew what he thought of the snack shack, or even if he'd decided Rena was connected to the shack at all. In other words, he needed to be Rena, but that was all. As long as he succeeded at being Rena, then. Actually, I don't know what happens then. He looked Laurent up and down. Laurent had struck him as a planner. He probably had plans for Rena, but who knew what they were? Aside from Laurent himself, no one could guess where he was going with this whole scenario. Laurent sighed. He looked Rhys over like Rhys had just done to him, though he probably wasn't thinking the same things Rhys was. Can it be all, just for tonight? Got it. So he's got some plan, but I guess we're sticking to the bare minimum of artifice that it's possible for him to have not identified me at the masquerade ball, and therefore he doesn't need to proceed to capturing me for the Empire, or whatever else he wants to do. Rhys nodded. He could appreciate Laurent looking aside for a night. It wasn't quite as romantic as Laurent probably thought it was, but it did make it easier for him to get out of it. I don't really get what's so trashy about all this, but it does seem to be working out for me, so, wait. Rhys's eyes widened. This romantic line. Laurent being foolish and deliberately looking the other way. A masquerade ball, and of course, a fantasy setting, weren't these the ingredients for one of the most famously trashy genres, the romantasy? True, they were mostly aimed at women, and not exactly built for Rhys, but he could appreciate a female lead as much as the next guy. It got a bit boring when the female lead had to get saved all the time no matter how strong she was, but there were a few good ones he'd enjoyed, even if the smutty bits were. Smutty bits. Rhys froze on the spot. Romantasy belonged firmly in the genre known as mommy porn, aka books that looked just legitimate enough that mothers could boldly read them in the open without anyone blinking, but were nonetheless packed cover to cover with bodice ripping, cheek slapping, heavy breathing action. If he was really in a romantasy scenario, then, he eyed up Laurent with mild concern. Hopefully the guy didn't have any intentions about going out on the balcony and getting handsy, or else they'd both be in trouble. At least it's not the other variety of mommy porn, Rhys thought to himself, or else we'd have to have some real bold conversations about anatomy and the physical possibilities that exist in this world. He'd made enough whoopsies with poorly tagged fanfiction to know the depths of depravity that existed in the female mind, and he really had no intention of personally discovering if male-male relationships were capable of producing fruit in this world. Not that he wanted a liaison with Laurent in the first place, but hopefully they could avoid any questions of that nature entirely, regardless of what decisions he had to make throughout the night. You look troubled. Please, don't concern yourself. My intentions truly are to dance, and no more, tonight, Laurent reassured Rhys. He led him onto the dance floor, sweeping past the other couples. Rhys glanced at him. In ways that Laurent would never know or understand, that did actually help a lot. That is good to hear. Mouse passed by, holding a plate laden with olives and cheese. She blinked at Rhys, shock and confusion on her face. I'll explain later. Keep the cheese safe, Rhys mouthed at her. Mouse blinked again, then nodded and scurried on, pretending they'd never interacted at all. They made it to the dance floor just as the first notes of a waltz began to play. Laurent clearly knew what he was doing, but Rhys had no idea. He followed Laurent's lead the best he could, which meant he moved with enough magely grace to look like he knew what he was doing, but lacked the preternatural beauty and grace of the other mages on the dance floor. Still, he'd take it. It was better than what he'd do if he were still mortal, which was trip all over his own feet. I'm sure you have nothing but questions, but, tonight, can we simply be two mages, with none of our past between us? You tore my core out, Rhys pointed out quietly. It was a lot for him to overlook. And you seem none the worse for it, Laurent replied, a note of smugness in his voice. For some reason, Rhys's anger spiked. He knew he shouldn't, but he couldn't stop himself. Speaking so quietly he could barely hear himself, even with mage hearing, he said, 3 years of my life. Stolen. I watched people die. Mages who should have had centuries ahead of them, brought low like mortals under your empire. He took a deep breath. Now was not the time. Besides, it wasn't as if he was going to convince Laurent, the original brainwashing fan, that the empire was evil. Plastering a smile on his face, he said, forget it. We're simply here to dance. To his surprise, Laurent's brow creased. He touched a round ruby pin on his chest, and the sounds around them muted, dampening to nothing. Rhys had a mild concern about what Laurent had been intending on doing with such a pin, but he forgot it as the man spoke. What do you mean? Prisoners are guaranteed rights under the empire. They must be adequately cared for and… All right. That's it. Rhys laughed in his face. Adequately cared for. That's a real joke. The things I've seen the guards do, you've never been to a camp, have you? It's a penal duty. I've never had the misfortune of being disciplined so harshly. Yeah, so what do you think your badly behaved officers do, huh? We have no recourse. No one we can turn to make things right. If someone decides to abuse the prisoners, or do whatever they like, who do you think stops them? Who can we turn to ask for things to be made right? There's no accountability, and all the guards are people who have misbehaved so poorly the empire puts them on penal duty. Do you think prisoners are treated with respect, under those circumstances? Do you really? I never thought about it, Laurent said quietly. Oh, you didn't, did you? Rhys thought, barely keeping himself from rolling his eyes. Laurent, not considering the downsides of the empire's policy. The original brainwashing boy himself, not thinking critically about the empire. A real shocker, right there. Rhys sighed. He looked at Laurent. Tonight is only dancing, but what is your plan for me, long-term? Are you going to chase me? Try to turn me in. Look the other way, and pretend you never saw me. I could never do that, Laurent said, aghast. You definitely could, Rhys encouraged him. You're too beautiful, Laurent continued, ignoring Rhys's practical interjection. I'm definitely not too beautiful. Do you not know your own beauty? I could wax poetic. No, that's fine, thanks, Rhys said, before he ended up with an earful of nonsense about how his eyes compared to stars, or whatever bullshit people said in romantasy novels. He'd rather hear about how handsome he was, but not from Laurent. Laurent's brow was still furrowed, though. I'll have to look into your allegations of abuse. If I find them to be true, that changes my next move. I'm glad to hear it. He didn't have high hopes, but if it tied Laurent up with chasing down better treatment for prisoners, rather than turning him in, then all the better. He paused. Don't do anything stupid like announcing that you're going to come by for an inspection, either. The guards will clean things up if you do, but only for as long as the inspection lasts. Then they're right back at their usual behavior, and nothing changes. That is counter to protocol, but I'll take it into consideration, Laurent allowed. He sighed and gripped Rhys tighter. I truly only wanted to dance, and yet you have laden me with more burdens. Is this the way we must always be? Rhys pulled away as subtly as he could. Seems like it. The old kicked puppy look appeared on Lauren's face. Why do you hesitate and pull away? Do you find the Empire so hideous that I, too, am undesirable? I find you undesirable because you're a man, bud, and you'll think the same of me when you find out, Rhys thought. Aloud, he said, perhaps. Then, if I make the Empire a shining paragon of truth and righteousness, as it should be, Laurent trailed off thoughtfully. He looked at Rhys with a thoughtful expression. Hey, there, what are you thinking about now? On the other hand, this actually benefited Rhys. It meant Laurent was not only distracted from chasing after Rena or reporting him, but was also going to cause a headache for the Empire as he raised all its deficiencies for them to clear. Internal strife while Rhys worked on causing all kinds of external strife. Exactly the puzzle piece his insurgency had been missing. Rhys said nothing. He was happy to let Laurent's imagination fill in the gaps. Anything he said would probably get misconstrued by Laurent anyways, so all the more reason to let him be the one to figure out what Rhys meant, now that he was thinking in a helpful direction. Laurent nodded. I will put my entire heart into the task. You will find me more than capable of making the Empire everything it should have been all this time, and then, a little smile appeared on Laurent's face. Glad you're so confident. Rhys didn't say anything, but let him draw his own conclusions once again. He was being a little less than ideal of a human being for not letting Laurent know clearly that he wasn't interested, but then, when had he ever claimed to be a perfect person, or even a good one, for that matter? He was trash, and he always had been. No one expected a trashy person to be completely clear about his or her romantic intentions, or lack thereof. The song came to an end. Rhys pulled away, but Laurent stepped after him, chasing him down. Are you sure we can't have one more song? I'm sure. He had things to do. Pivotal moments to see too. And if Lord Esto's moving steadily toward the front of the room was any indication, that pivotal moment was coming up fast. Reluctantly, Laurent released him. Then, can I find you? Absolutely not. To his surprise, Laurent took it in stride. Of course. It would be counter to my intentions were I to risk my reputation openly cavorting with you. How thoughtful. Even I had not yet considered such a risk. Yep, that was definitely why he'd said no. Laurent released him at last. Until we meet again. See ya. Rhys hurried away. He didn't go back to the same pillar, but wandered around the outside until he ran into Mouse. She gave him a look, and he waved his hand. An old friend. You mean that Empire soldier who's desperately in love with Rena, Mouse replied. There was something odd about her tone, but Rhys couldn't place it. Yeah, him. Still as confused as ever. Is everything ready for our pivotal moment? She nodded. Ready to go. Rhys clapped and nodded. Then let's get to it. Lord Estos strode to the head of the ballroom, a confident smile on his face. No troublemakers had showed up to his ball. In fact, according to the guards, they hadn't even sensed an attempt on the defenses, and everything was moving along smoothly. Drink flowed, snacks were eaten, and couples danced upon the ballroom floor with all the careless wonder and abandon they usually did. Not a single ghost to be seen, not that ghosts were real, but he'd kept that ne'er-do-well who was tastelessly posing as Adelisa's ghost out of his ball, and that was all that mattered. Everything was on track. His brow furrowed at the reminder. How rude, to pose as poor Adelise. It must be one of the Inferin clan's enemies, perhaps that bald-headed Jordache clan who had always been jealous of the Infernan's thick manes. Especially with Adelise missing, and not officially proclaimed dead yet, it made the Infernans look like fools. Now that everyone was starting to calm down from the camp breakouts and focus on important things once again, the Infernans would soon have to produce Adelise, or declare her dead. They couldn't keep this halfway stance alive, with her, ghost, causing trouble at ball after ball. His greatest fear was that the ghost would do something drastic before they denounced it as definitely not the missing Adelise, and allow their enemies to throw dirt on the Infernan family name, even though everyone knew the ghost was nothing but a foolish interloper. That was exactly why he'd worked so hard to keep the ghost out of his ball. If the troublemaker wanted to land a fatal blow on the Infernon family, they wouldn't do it at his ball. He couldn't control everything, but he could control that much. He wanted the Infernons to see him as the staunch ally he was, and he wouldn't be much of an ally if it was at his ball that the foul villainess posing as Adelisa's ghost decided to launch whatever attack they were clearly building toward. But everything was going so well, and not a single troublesome ghost in sight. The musicians finished their song, and Lord Estos stepped forward, raising a glass. He rapped his fingernails against it. Ting, ting. The dancers looked up, parting from their partners. The wallflowers stepped out from the pillars. A few slightly rumpled couples materialized on the upper walkway, reappearing from the nooks and alcoves that were just perfectly sized for a couple to have a lucky moment of privacy together. They were his wife's idea, and he had no doubt that she was taking close note of who'd emerged from which alcove even at this moment, the irredeemable gossip that she was, but that was none of his concern. He gazed over his guests and smiled. Welcome, one and all. I hope you've been enjoying the masquerade. There were a few titters, a few knowing looks exchanged on the balconies, and a few glasses raised. Lord Estos smiled back at them. Before this night truly begins, I wanted to say a few words. I know things have been trying lately, with the breakouts and the ongoing war, but I hope you were able to put all that behind you to take advantage of this night to the fullest. I have it on good word that the military police are close to finding the criminals involved in the breakout. In fact, they should be moving in on their base as we speak. So make merry, and please enjoy tonight without a single worry in your mind. A cheer went up from the crowd. Lord Estos beamed back. He turned to the musicians. So, Maestro, would you? Not so fast. Come on, it can't be that difficult to strap on. It is. Rhys, why would you build it like this? It's so hard. Just jab it in there already. Use your strength, and you can get it in. But it's huge. Like a pipe. How am I supposed to fit it in that hole? Here, give it to me. I'll do it myself. There was fumbling. A grunt. He's almost done with the speech, Rhys. Hurry. It's coming together. Just right there. Click. Rhys checked over the assemblage one last time, then nodded at Mouse. She released her hold on him and stepped away. He strode forward, out of the shadows and into the light at the very front of the rafters. Not so fast. All eyes lifted to the sky, staring at him. He'd stepped out of the darkness over Lord Estos's head, into direct view of all the mages. For a moment, everyone simply stared, even the guards unclear on what to do. Down on the dance floor, a man in red with a straight white ponytail squinted. Rhys grinned. Reaching to his face, he tore the mask free, revealing his perfected Adelise Infernon makeup. How dare you dance, when my death goes unavenged, even today? Not that he cared, or minded at all, but if they really thought they'd caught the criminals, he might as well throw some suspicion that they'd gotten the wrong guys. He was pretty sure they had, anyways, since he'd seen no sniffing around any of his farms or shops, but he couldn't be completely certain that everyone was safe, so might as well throw a little random mud. He lifted his hands, and the assemblage he'd been slotting into place with Mouse's help ignited. To this day, fire still evaded him. Everything from a candle flame to a fireball remained beyond his reach, since he valued the skills too much. But that didn't mean he had no way to access fire. Decomposing organic garbage gave off fumes, specifically, methane. All he had to do was section off a portion of his trash star for organic trash and start specifically absorbing what came out of that section for non-trash star purposes, and hey presto, he had a source of methane. From there, it was just a matter of extracting it from his trash star, compressing it into a tank, and piping it down to his hands. He could simply exhale the methane, but there were two problems. It wasn't condensed enough to create a steady stream, and he had to manually ignite it and focus on keeping the flow at the same time. It was a lot to do mentally or magically, and while he was sure he could manage it eventually, it wasn't going to happen in time for this neat trick. Hence the tank and pipes. This fire was formed from trash, so he could shape it somewhat, if not perfectly. He scoured the ceiling of the dance hall, then directed the flames further down the walls. The mages down below screamed and ran, but a few, including a familiar man in red, lunged for him. He chuckled. Too bad for them, but he'd expected such a reaction. The fires he'd set had appeared to create no smoke, but that wasn't true. They created smoke, it was just smoke that Rhys immediately absorbed. Now, he spat it back out, instantly filling the dance hall with thick, dark smoke. In the chaos the smoke caused, Rhys ripped off his robes and wig and tossed them into the flame, then pushed the flames into the tubes of his contraption and ripped it off his back, tossing it at the ground with all the speed and strength he could muster. The contraption exploded, and Rhys flew backward into the flame-weakened roof and crashed through. He landed in a smoking pile outside, falling in with all the guests as they fled the fire. Mouse appeared at his side and took his shoulder, heaving him up. He was dressed as a man, now, in a servant's simpler gear and his true messy hair, made even more mope-like by his sweat and the wig. Still a little stunned from the explosion, he let her lead him away. I might have overloaded that tank. Turns out, a Tier 3 mage can manage a hell of a lot of compression, beyond the limits of physics. He wasn't really complaining, of course. An explosion of that caliber guaranteed that he and Mouse had enough panic to easily slip away. Like that, he attacked at the heart of the Empire right as the Empire got tired of searching for the people who'd been involved in the camp attack, and gave them a new phantom to chase. Now, the only remaining trick was to sneak away and never appear again, and let them chase what they could never find. He could be done with his play acting, and focus on gathering cores from the criminals while the Empire scrambled to search for the ghost. Once he got all the cores he needed, all the pieces were in place. It would be time to take down the Empire. But first, he had to get away. With everyone fleeing the fire, it was easy enough to mingle with the guests. Some stopped once they were outside, or turned back and ran in to go help, but some just made for the forest or for their carriages, the less combat-inclined mages, who preferred to research, farm herbs and raise animals, or do office work for the Empire. Rhys and Mouse blended in with them, breaking through the barrier and racing into the woods beyond. Rhys glanced over his shoulder. It didn't look like anyone was following. He turned to Mouse. "We got Awa." Thump. A blaze of red blasted down in front of them. Mouse squeaked and jumped away, and Rhys whirled, already drawing his broken sword. Laurent faced him. He took off his mask and tossed it aside, and they faced one another with bare faces. No more disguises. No more lies. What are you really after? I'm tearing down the corruption in this empire. Can't you see that? Or are you so blindly devoted to your mother country that you see no fault in its nobility? Rhys countered. It was bullshit, but Laurent didn't need to know that. From beside him, Mouse faded slowly from existence. Rhys didn't call attention to her or acknowledge what she was doing, but he fully understood. If she left now, that was one less thing for Rhys to have to worry about in the impending battle. By setting Lord Estos's ballroom on fire, Laurent drew his own sword, a challenge in his eyes. Is not the presence of the nobility itself a black mark upon the Empire's claimed meritocracy? That gave Laurent pause. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. I want to challenge the Empire. Push its limits. You've grown up within it, and cannot see its base failings for what they are. Look harder, Laurent. You'll see what I mean. All I see right now is a base criminal, Laurent said, his eyes hardening. Damn it. Guess I can't bullshit my way through this one. Rhys searched mentally for a way out, but he hadn't set anything up. His plans had ended at ditching his disguise and running for it. He hadn't expected to run into Laurent and get recognized by him. Look harder. If you can't understand now, then there's nothing I have left to say to you. Rhys lifted his sword and prepared to attack. Laurent raised his in response. The two of them stared at each other for a long beat, and then, "Take me with you," Mouse shouted, jamming a trash bag over Rhys's head. For a second, he hesitated, but then he immediately understood. Grabbing Mouse's arm, he leapt into the void. A second after they vanished, Laurent's sword cleaved through the bag. He stood there for a second, staring at the emptiness, expressions chasing one another across his face. Confusion, disbelief, irritation, and then shock and realization. He put a hand on his chin, his eyes wide. No. Could it be? On the other side of the trash bag, Rhys pulled Mouse along after himself through the void. He looked at her. Good job. I didn't think to bring anything for our escape. I always think about escaping, Mouse replied timidly. Ah, yeah, that tracks. Rhys smiled and patted her on the back. Saved our bacon this time. So, keep it up. Mouse looked down, blushing a little bit. She smiled and nodded. Come on, let's get out of this place, and get on with taking down the Empire. Rhys dove for the nearest exit, and they left Lord Esto's palace behind. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. As Rhys had predicted, the Empire immediately leapt to Lord Esto's assistance. The hunt for the camp escapees died down with the arrest of a few known criminals and familiar dissidents, leaving Rhys free to act once more. One quick trip to the local stream, and he reset his bone structure back to its usual settings, only barely resisting the urge to get a little experimental. Now wasn't the time to fuck around, notwithstanding his latest round of fucking around as Adelise, which hadn't been fucking around at all, actually, but a brilliant and important step in his plan to take down the Empire. Still, the point remained the same, he had to keep his eye on the prize. Which was why he, Lyra, Sable, and Mouse were currently crouched outside the biggest base he could find with his voluminous snack shack/whisper network. It didn't hurt that some of the ex-criminals were pretty forthcoming about their former bosses, whether they'd been press-ganged into service or because they simply didn't appreciate the old heads. According to them and his own research alike, this was the biggest gathering of all the criminal bases in the area. A seductive cry echoed over their heads. Thick, floral perfumes and the sharp but sweet scent of alcohol drifted on the air. Curtains fluttered on the breeze, and men and women giggled at one another in soft, knowing tones. Why did you take us to a brothel? Are you going to sell us off? Lyra asked, in mock terrified tones. If you wanted to enjoy yourself, no need to bring us along, Sable intoned dryly. Mouse recoiled, staring at Rhys with wide eyes. Rhys put his head in his hands. Come on, guys. I didn't know what kind of place it was until I showed up here, either. Lyra cracked a grin. Nice excuse. Hey, you wanna go enjoy some sake? Maybe, take a rest in the inn. Man, all three of us at once, huh? Damn, that's some confidence. How big did you make it? I didn't, Rhys sighed. Are you done? I could go on for hours. He gave her a look. But I'll stop. Mouse might murder me in my sleep, otherwise. Mouse jumped, startled. Should we wait until night? Sable suggested. Everyone looked at her. Lyra was the first to look away. So, do you want to try some arson again? Or maybe a fake monster scare? We've got a fake monster right there. She pointed at Sable, then at herself. And right here, 2 fake monsters. Could do poison, too. I don't want to kill everyone in the brothel, Rhys countered. Sure, he didn't care overly much for the degenerates in the brothel, but he didn't think a deadly gas cloud of impurities was the way to go about clearing the room, either. As for fake monsters, he pinched his chin. He didn't want to attract the Empire's attention that much. They were distracted by the attack on Lord Esto's, but not that distracted. Wanna go as girls? Try and get recruited, Lyra suggested. Mouse's face instantly swapped from neutral to murder. Sable's expression didn't change at all, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that Rhys didn't like very much. He waved his hand. No, I've had my fill of cross-dressing for a while. Really? Lyra asked doubtfully. Yeah, it's not like I'm insatiable or anything. There's an upper limit. Anyways. Rhys took a deep breath. We shouldn't do anything drastic, like a monster scare, chemical warfare, or a bomb threat. Bomb. Like that tank attack we did in the mansion, Rhys clarified, glancing at Mouse. She nodded, understanding. Rather, the brothel itself is just a cover. The actual criminals are, probably running the brothel, but they're mostly going to be under the brothel, probably. It's been their modus operandi so far. I think we should just, you know. He shrugged. Walk in the front door. It's a business, guys. It's doing business. Serving customers. We can just go in. Lyra crossed her arms and rolled her eyes. Where's your sense of drama? I've been doing nothing but drama lately. Cut me a break, Rhys complained. I think he's got a good idea, Mouse piped up softly. Sable nodded. No one appreciates me. Hey, bring me to the parties next time. Mouse didn't even enjoy them, Lyra complained. I'll bring you to the next party you're suited for. If they have a yacht party, you'll be my first pick, Rhys promised. Yacht. Big-ass fancy ship. Hell yeah. Is that a common thing? Rhys shook his head. Sorry, nope. But it is where the fanciest of fancy parties take place. Lyra thought about it for a moment, then nodded. Okay, I accept. But only because they're the fanciest possible parties. Yeah, come on. Everyone, try to look as lascivious as possible. He paused. Except you, Lyra. You're fine as is. I can look a lot more lascivious. You don't need to. I promise. I've still got all these clothes on. And I'm grateful for that. I wake up every day and praise the gods that you're still clothed. This is downright modest for water sprites. We appreciate your sacrifices for the greater good. Lyra sighed loudly. All right. If no one in this prude squad wants to have any fun, then let's get this show on the road. I want to have fun, Sable said. You heard the nice lady. Let's get moving, Rhys said, pushing to his feet. Mouse nodded and hopped up, sticking close to them. Sable stayed crouched for a few more moments, staring after the other three, then blinked and followed them. The brothel was on the edge of this city, surrounded by the forest. It perched on the edge of a valley lake, and gazed out over the placid water to the gorgeous view of the mountains rolling all around them. It was a tall building, and layered balconies on its rear served to give couples a fine view of the surroundings, or a chance to let their exhibitionism fly, both of which seemed to be happening in equal measure. As a consequence, they'd been crouching by the side of the brothel, where there were few windows and no balconies. Now, they emerged from the forest, dusting a few leaves off their clothes. A man staggered out of the brothel and stared, his brows raising almost to his hairline. Good day, good sir, Rhys greeted him. There was really no way to sugarcoat what it looked like they'd been doing, so he just had to own it and hope the guy moved on past. The man stared for another beat, then shook his head and staggered on. Drunkenly, he muttered as he passed, people get off on all kind of things. Ah, haha, Rhys sighed. He wasn't going to worry too much about some random drunk brothel patron's impression of him, but it definitely wasn't his intention to peek on the brothel. Lyra put a comforting hand on his shoulder. It's okay. We already knew you were a pervert. I'm not. Another sigh welled up from deep within him. Rhys shook his head, then reached back and let down his ponytail, deliberately messing it up a little. Lyra gave him a disapproving look, but Rhys didn't care. He didn't need to look reputable right now. And, fair, he knew his hair was barely in order at the best of times, but it was fine even if it was a bird's nest right now. As long as he didn't look like the paint-smeared harlequin who ran the snack shop, he was fine with looking like anything. Sable adjusted her bones, making sure they were hidden under her cape, though the gloves and bone corset still stood out a bit, and, of course, the giant strangely stiff cape didn't help. Lyra fit right in, though she looked more like she was a member of the brothel than a visitor. Mouse cringed at the edge of their group and looked as though she wanted to fade directly out of reality, which, to everyone else, is probably what she did. Rhys wasn't really sure what it was, whether he'd gotten used to Mouse's techniques from having seen them so much, or he'd learned what to look for, or what, but he was better at detecting Mouse than before. Even when she wanted to vanish, he could often see her nowadays, or at least generally sense her presence. It wasn't 100%. When she wanted to vanish, she could vanish from his sight, too, and it definitely wasn't as if he could always detect when Mouse was around, let alone where she was. But when she was just generally vanishing from everyone's view, he could typically sense her. He didn't look her way now. He didn't want her to know that he could sense her nowadays. It was rude to look at someone who wanted to vanish in any world, and that definitely applied here, too. The fact that Mouse could use magic to make it happen, and that he could see through that magic, didn't change the base principles of leaving shy people to disappear when they wanted to be unseen. Besides, there was so much to see. Or not see. Or unsee. There were quite a few public displays in the lobby that he certainly wished he could stop seeing, but even when he directed his eyes away, he could still hear the grunts and moans. His ears burned despite himself, and, unrelated, a long history of porn watching having desensitized him to such things. It seemed like this was less a traditional brothel, and more a swingers hangout cum exhibitionism hall cum brothel, all the cums deliberate. He couldn't decide where to look, and landed on the ceiling, until he remembered that mages could fly just in time to dodge some questionable fluid from the sky. Where the hell is the reception desk? Is there a reception desk? Is there anyone to stop us from just walking in? Hell, did they even care? For that matter, where was the criminal base part of the brothel? Were the other criminals just playing a big joke on him? This thing back to the lake. True, there was forest all around it, and it was a big building, but... Stay strong, Rhys. Surely, somewhere in this den of iniquity, there's a criminal base. Probably. Maybe. And then, man, I'm gonna look so dumb/horny if there's nothing here. Lyra nudged him. I like this place. That tracks, Rhys deadpanned. He scanned the room one more time, even if his eyes burned to do it, then pointed. Come on. Let's go see if we can find something. They proceeded deeper into the brothel. Further, Rhys corrected himself. There was a lot of, deeper, going on around them, and it made it hard to keep the word out of his mind. Still no attendant, which he was starting to take as the way this place operated. He wasn't sure how you booked services or paid for them, but everyone else seemed to have it all figured out, and it wasn't as though he actually was a client, so it all worked out. Based on his previous experiences, the criminal base would be underground, but this inn was on the edge of a lake. There couldn't be a basement, unless they liked getting flooded all the time, and also having a constant water rat infestation. But the upper floors seemed to be so busy. There couldn't be a huge base in here with all the usage the rooms were undergoing. Then again, they were living in the land of mages. He looked up thoughtfully. He wouldn't be too surprised if there was some kind of hidden portal or formation to link this place and somewhere else, where they could actually fit a large base. He grimaced at himself. I need to get out of here. All these words are polluting my brain. For a brief moment, he wondered if he could turn the words he was hearing into trash, but then he remembered that he already had his mental attack. This was merely more trauma to throw on the heap, and then dump into someone else's mind. Still, this was a way to improve his mental attack, wasn't it? Right now, he had one kind of mental attack, which was basically just trauma dumping his years in the mine, but if he met someone else who'd been pinned down by the Empire, it wouldn't do that much to them, would it? It depended on the person, really. Some people it would trigger worse, some people would be unaffected. The point was, every person had their own things that bothered them or conversely, didn't. Someone who felt nothing at seeing his suffering in the mines might be deeply troubled by him hammering them with a load of, excuse me, a dump of, no wait that's not better, a lot of moaning, squealing, and body fluids. As a formerly porn-addicted internet dweller, this was nothing. It was in 3D surround sound, but he could prevail. He could overcome. So, rather than blocking it out, he started soaking it in. It was for his technique, for his skill. He had to watch that horrific yet interesting thing those three people were doing over there. For his skill. For the mental attack. It was selfless. He didn't want to, but he had to. Honestly, everyone should appreciate his dedication to his skill and path, and seek to emulate his devotion. The things he did for skills, like. Rhys pulled a face. Okay, that's just actually gross. Rhys. He jolted. Yeah, I wasn't, never mind. What is it? Lyra gave him a knowing yet equally sarcastic look, then thumbed up. Mouse scurried ahead. She says there's something interesting upstairs. More interesting than that. Sable followed his gaze. She pinched her chin, a thoughtful expression on her face that Rhys had thought completely impossible in a place like this. Slowly, she tilted her head. Lyra turned. One brow arced. More interesting than the all-female foursome. She probably thinks so. Right. Yes. Let's go hurry up to the criminal base. Rhys said firmly, nodding. Sable gazed at the party in the corner a little longer, then snorted and followed Rhys and Lyra upstairs. The brothel was a gorgeous place, when it wasn't being thoroughly debased the way it was right now. Lacquered wood banisters climbed the levels, while each layer up led to a central internal balcony. From the first floor, Rhys could see the ceiling, the entire building hollow in the middle to allow patrons to get a good look at the candelabra high overhead. Gauzy curtains drifted in the breeze that flowed in from opened windows on the outside, clearly meant to obscure the ongoing acts, but utterly failing in their duty. A fine rug stretched underfoot, though desecrated by bodily fluids. Rhys tilted his head. If he wasn't wrong, this place hadn't been this kind of night-clubby, swingers party kind of place before. The building itself had a refined atmosphere, and the curtains and folding wooden screens, all folded back and pushed aside, now, suggested that it was meant to hide as much as it revealed to passing patrons, not give everyone a good look at everything there was to see. He pursed his lips, then nodded to himself. On second thought, it made a lot of sense. He'd been thinking that this was the kind of establishment that had been set up by criminals, for criminals, but that was by the morality of his world. In this world, brothels were relatively socially acceptable. Looked down on, but not seen as the ultimate evil, or something worth jailing people over. Most criminal establishments in this world probably ran brothels the same way criminals in his world ran laundromats, to launder money. This criminal establishment was just a little bit stupid. Probably deliberately allowed to exist because they're stupid, under the Empress, Rhys thought to himself. He considered a moment. And maybe deliberately acting stupid so the Empress lets them exist. In any case, there was one small room, up toward the top of the establishment, that was completely enclosed. Rhys eyed it hesitantly, but his fears melted away when Mouse poked her head out of the room and gestured them in. He sighed in relief. Good. It's not some kind of aerial sex dungeon. No one stopped them, all the way to the top. The hairs on the back of Rhys's neck stood on end. By now, it was weird that no one had stepped in. He thought about it with all his might, but there was no indication that they'd be striking here, sure, except for all those ex-criminals I asked about this location. They wouldn't even all have to collaborate, there would just have to be one bad apple with their ear to the ground, listening to figure out what the consensus was, then sell out to their ex-bosses. They didn't even need to be particularly devoted to the old cause. They could just be in it for the money. Yeah, we should probably proceed under the assumption that the criminals know we're coming. He looked around at the other girls as they followed Mouse into the room. Everyone, be careful. They probably know we're. As he stepped into the room, a loud hiss sounded out, and pink gas clouded the air. Rhys immediately pushed the girls back and stepped deeper into the room, sweeping his hand through the air. The pink gas collected into a marble on his palm, then vanished into his core. A feminine voice chuckled. I see the rumors were true. You are a poison master of some skill. Come out. Rhys called, looking around the room. It was a small room, not much larger than the average hotel room, and completely walled with dark wood. Aside from a small metal ring on the floor, with the requisite mana batteries and spell detailing, there wasn't much in the room at all. And there definitely wasn't any sort of woman, aside from his friends. The female voice laughed again. Do you think me so foolish? If you can't find me, then why would I reveal myself? I dunno, it works sometimes, Rhys said. Blame him for watching the kind of trashy shows where the villain would come out when someone shouted, come out. He hadn't expected it to work, but these criminals had seemed a little dim-witted, so he figured he'd give it a try. The pink gas continued to flow. Rhys searched around, then finally found the source, a small orb near the door. He picked it up and tossed it into his mouth, sending it directly to his core. You've fallen for my trap, the female voice declared. She laughed uproariously. You're a poison master, but that was no poison. It was an aphrodisiac. Can you overcome such a potent formula as a mere poison master, when you torture your body every day with foul fluids, but never think to test it against more beneficial compounds? Now, squirm, writhe in agony, turn your hands against your own friends. Sable gave him a look. Her cape shifted dangerously. Lyra licked her lips. Mouse outright vanished. Rhys sighed. It's okay, everyone. I'm fine. Yeah, Lyra asked. Totally fine. The mysterious feminine voice had misjudged him. He wasn't a poison master, but a trash master. He didn't know if aphrodisiacs would work on poison masters or not. He honestly couldn't say, but when it came to him, aphrodisiacs were definitely trash. The number of times he'd seen Rhino Power 5000 Ultimate Hardness! Exclamation mark! At the convenience store, or received an email or pop-up ad about how he could make himself so much larger and firmer if only he clicked that definitely legitimate link. There was nothing anyone could do to convince him they weren't trash. Sure, he'd maybe felt a tiny tingle when the gas had first leapt out at him, but the second he'd realized what was going on, he'd pulled all the toxins out of his bloodstream and regained control of himself. The feminine voice was only fooling herself if she thought this was going to be a problem for him. Is anyone else bothered by it? I can remove it from your bloodstream, Rhys offered, holding out his hand. You pulled it in too fast. I didn't even take a breath, Lyra said, maybe a little regretfully. Mouse shook her head. Sable considered for a moment, then indicated, no, as well. He turned back around. Yeah, I don't think anyone's bothered by it. So, if you've got a next step in your plan, you probably want to move on to whatever that is. The female voice fell silent. As their mysterious new friend thought about her life choices, Rhys turned to Mouse. Head outside. Scout for danger, he mouthed. They were all boxed in up here, and he didn't like it. If the voice had been stalling for time, or trying to weaken them before an attack group swept in, then they'd be making their move in the brothel right now. He wanted to be aware of it before it went bad. Mouse nodded and backed out of the room. Rhys turned to the other two. Do either of you know magical, assemblages well? Is it possible that she's projecting her voice from somewhere else, or even from the other side of this portal thingy? I kill things, Sable said quietly. Lyra and Rhys both stared at her, and then Lyra thumbed over her shoulder. Yeah, what she said. Rhys sighed. Yeah, I don't know what I was expecting. Of everyone here, his best bet was honestly Mouse. He had avoided formal learning like the plague. Lyra was some kind of cast-out water sprite who'd been raised in the wild, and only recently joined human society. Sable was the daughter of a remnant weapon who'd been generally looked down on, mistreated, and given a role as an enforcer/executioner whether she liked it or not. When would any of them have learned how to work magical contraptions? Mouse, on the other hand, was a true-blooded human woman who liked hiding, but otherwise had been raised in polite society and had attended all her schooling. Not only that, but she hung out in libraries and spent all her time reading. She'd know how this thing worked, if any of them did, but she was also their most powerful stealth unit, and he'd just sent her out of the room to scout out the area. Rhys sighed. We need to stop overloading Mouse so much. I need more people who are good at things. What? How rude. Lyra proclaimed, scandalized. Sable's cape shifted again. Her gaze darkened. I mean, good at things that aren't fighting. Rhys quickly amended, raising his hands. He really hadn't meant that these two weren't good at things, it had just slipped out. Good at things, and good at things were two different phrases, and he'd said one, but meant the other. You'll never discover my trick. The woman proclaimed boldly. Well, yeah. We just told you none of us know anything about magical engineering. Duh, Rhys said, just trying to be as obnoxious as possible. Mouse reappeared at the door. There's no one, why's everyone looking at me? Rhys grinned. Just in time. Mouse, come here. Mouse knelt at the magical circle, tilting her head left and right as she got a closer look. It really is a portal, but if you're asking me if there's something else attached. Yeah, Or if it goes somewhere bad, Rhys added. The female voice was thoughtfully silent. Well, I can't tell you that. A portal is a portal, so unless you're getting vibes from the portal, there's no way to say what's on the other side. But if there's something that lets her attach her voice, she leaned in, then pointed. That, right there. That kind of looks like a voice-throwing enchantment, doesn't it? She turned back to a room full of idiots, who shrugged helplessly at her. Mouse sighed. Really? This is from Enchantments Level 1. It's one of the first enchantments they teach you. I remember the boys in our class kept throwing voice throwers into the girls' dorms for weeks after they taught us that. I'm more of a learn-by-doing kind of guy, Rhys said. I bet you don't know how to identify the specific kind of water snail needed to turn a skin-melting potion into the best flesh-repairing salve known to water sprite kind, Lyra challenged her. Sable looked at the other two, then thought for a moment. At last, she added, I kill things. Rhys glanced at her. We got that the first time. Wait, hold on. Was that a joke? Does Sable actually have a sense of humor? Their eyes met. Sable smiled. Rhys shook his head, smiling himself. Well, I'll be damned. I had no idea. I guess even skittering creatures that lurk in the dark enjoy a joke every now and again. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to belittle your experiences, Mouse said, the apology heartfelt. I was joking, just joking. We were all useless to figure this thing out, so we're glad you have some idea of what's going on. Rhys reached down and plucked off the piece she'd pointed out. Mouse jolted. I wasn't sure. She looked at the portal, then at the tidbit Rhys held. Hello. You cannot escape your doom. Even now, Rhys closed his hand around the object, quieting the voice. Yep, looks like we were right. He looked around at the girls, then back at the portal. Do we want to risk it, or do we think it's pointed somewhere dangerous? Yes, it's pointed directly into a volcano. Use it and burn to ash. The voice on the line cheered. Rhys closed his eyes. How stupid is she? Well, either this is a 5000 IQ play and we're about to die, or it's completely safe. There's probably a bunch of strong dudes on the other side, at least, Lyra pointed out. Sable's eyes glittered, and she stepped forward. Yeah, probably, but, Rhys looked around. I mean, are we scared of that? Mouse fumbled around in her storage ring, then withdrew a familiar bag. If it's bad, can't you use this, Rhys? Rhys pointed at her. Excellent point. Hand that over. I'll go in first. Here, he tossed Lyra the speaking bauble. I'll find that lady and shout for you if it's safe. Or pop back through, if that's untenable. Sound good. Sounds good to me, Lyra agreed. I want to go, Sable said, stepping forward. Even if it's lava, I should be fine. Rhys considered for a moment, then nodded. Sable was pretty hardy. Of everyone here, she was the only person he knew could survive an impure well, and on top of that, her battle skills really were top-notch. If they came out into any terrain, surrounded by a bunch of beefy men, Sable would have no problem taking on her fair share of the battle. Of course, if he brought Mouse, she would just vanish, and it wasn't like Lyra wasn't a force of her own, but of the three of them, Sable had the most raw battle prowess. Not only that, but he'd been leaving her on guard duty far too much. She needed opportunities to level up and get stronger, just like everyone else. If she was volunteering, he wasn't going to turn her down. All right, you come with me, Sable. He held out his hand, and she took it. Mouse scratched the back of her head and looked away. Rhys turned back and saluted. He and Sable stepped forward into the portal. If you never hear from me again, you know what happened. Lyra saluted. Congratulations on your elopement. Rhys only had enough time to roll his eyes at her. There was a bright light, and he and Sable both vanished. Back in the room, Mouse sighed. Lyra looked at her. If you want him, you have to make a move, girl. He's blind, deaf and blind, and all you do is hide. He's never going to be the first one to act. It can only be you. But, she sighed again. Lyra rolled her eyes. Come on. Sable's in the running, too, and she's got that savage energy, you know what I mean. If you leave things, she's gonna jump his bones, and he's not going to say no. He's not that kind of guy, to hold out for someone else when he's got a meal right in front of him. Mouse looked at the floor. She kicked the dust. I know, but do you need some help? There's some water sprite tricks I could share with you. The famous, hey, let's go skinny dipping, usually works, but there's always the, whoopsie, I spilled some water, or the somewhat more subtle. I don't need any tricks. I don't, Mouse said, blushing furiously. Lyra blinked. Her mouth opened into an, oh. Slowly, she smiled. Oh, I see. How cute, Mousy. I didn't know. Mouse's entire face, ears, and neck were bright red. Shut up. You're doing just fine, girl. Just keep going. Slow and steady wins the race. That's not what you were saying 10 seconds ago. I didn't know the whole situation 10 seconds ago. I didn't know. Mouse scowled. Aren't you into him, too? Me? I mean, he's reasonably attractive, I guess. Wouldn't say no. He's kinda trash though. A one-night kind of guy, not forever. Mouse gave her a look. Well, yeah. Now that I know, it's hands off, okay. I'm not that desperate. Mouse sighed again. Lyra patted her shoulder. You'll do it, girl. You just have to believe. On the other side of the portal, completely unaware of the conversation going on behind them, Rhys and Sable stepped out into a big, open field. Just as Rhys had predicted, they were surrounded by burly men and women. He cracked his knuckles. You ready, Sable? No volcano, Sable muttered, sounding a little sad. The men advanced, cracking their knuckles. A few of them drew weapons. Scanning the crowd, Rhys reached out and quietly scanned their tiers. Mostly 1s and 2s. A single low 3 at the back of the crowd. Rhys chuckled. Weak. Honestly, he could probably take them on alone. No, Sable could do it alone, even. We can go to a volcano after this. But first, let's bust some heads. I have this crowd. You find the woman, Sable told him. Her bony limbs unfolded from under her cape, and her eyes glinted with dangerous red light. So she noticed, too. He nodded. You've got this, then. You think you can get past us, skinny boy? One of the burly tier 1s shouted, too low tier to be able to sense Rhys's tier. Rhys didn't turn his way. He lifted his finger and pointed at him. 3. Oh, you trying to scare me? 2. Shaking his head, the man chuckled as he and his fellows closed in. You're gonna have to do worse than. Using his tier 3 speed, Rhys kicked off the ground. His hand impacted the man's face and tore right through it, out the other side. Blood and gore splattered across the ground. Rhys blinked. I was just trying to knock him to the ground. I guess tier 1s are just too delicate for me to handle roughly nowadays. Quickly swallowing his surprise, he turned to the group and delivered the quip he'd planned on. 1. A few of the other tier 1s blanched. One of them turned and outright fled, and a few of the others looked like they were considering joining in. If anyone else wants to stop me. No. Rhys smiled. He knelt and sucked the dead criminal into his trash core, then strutted away, waving over his shoulder. All yours, Sable. He'd come here to collect mana for new cores, but these criminals were so low tier it was barely worth it. True, he'd been glad to get tier 1 and 2 cores not long ago, but up ahead, he could sense lots of meaty, juicy, higher level cores, so even if he let this group of low tier men slide, he wouldn't be seriously missing out on anything. Better that he trained up Sable, than worried overmuch about getting every ounce of mana out of this encounter. He needed more high tier 2s, or if he was lucky, tier 3 combatants. And Sable, as his fellow tier 3, needed to get stronger more than anyone else. She was only LOW3 right now, but if she could climb to MID3, or even HIGH3, capable of fighting multiple 3s and even 4s, then their power as a team would climb by leaps and bounds. Clattering, as if dry bones sounded from behind him, followed by hideous screams and horrible squelching noises. Rhys winced, but resolutely didn't turn. Nope. Whatever's going on back there, I want none of it. He extended the range of his mana, searching as far as he could. It wasn't hard to find the next group of people, they were just up ahead, past the thick forest that walled off the end of the field. At first glance, he sensed a few Tier 3s and at least one Tier 4, though the Tier 4 was off a little ways and somewhat separated from the rest of the group. There was plenty of Tier 1 and 2 chaff, but considering what he'd just accidentally done to a Tier 1, he wasn't too worried about them. Reluctantly, he checked behind him to find Sable quite literally taking apart one of the large men. He turned back around and raced for the forest. I can leave her to that with no worries. She's definitely got it handled. He dashed toward the forest. The signatures were arrayed in the forest as though they were meant to ambush whoever entered, but he could clearly sense all of them with his mana, so it wasn't exactly effective. He surged toward the obvious path through the woods as if he meant to run down it, then leapt away at the last moment and flashed behind the closest Tier 3 signature. The man whirled, but too late. Rhys exuded his trash breath into the man's face, and while he was reeling, he finished him off with his trash intent. I wonder, Rhys whirled his hand, calling the trash gas to him. He lifted the broken sword and used trash manipulation to form the trash gas into a blade shape, then activated trash intent on the trash gas blade. The blade immediately began to dissipate. Quickly, he activated trash manipulation again, then held his hand out. Trash manipulation and trash intent is one. Form the blade from the corrupting gas, then hold it there with one skill, not two. Intent and manipulation is one. Intent awakened a material, called forth its memories and reminded it of its original shape, or evoked what it wanted to become. Manipulation allowed Rhys to shape the thing the way he wanted to determine its new form and desires. Both of them gave form to the formless. Both of them made desires real. The only difference was whose desires it activated on, but what if he merged their desires? What if he made his desires and the trash's desires one and the same? To become one with the trash. To merge with the trash's desires. Rhys shut his eyes, focusing. He felt the trash gas. Its desire to corrode, to fly freely. He felt the sword's desires, its need to cut, to have a blade. Reaching out to both, he drew them together, pressing one onto another. To the gas, he introduced the sword's need for form, its need to cut. To the sword, he introduced the gas-free flowing nature and its desire to corrupt. The two desires met. The sword wanted to cut, yes, but more than that, it wanted to destroy. To kill. However it got there, it was fine with accomplishing the same goal. The gas wanted to corrode and flow, but the sword could move, too. The sword could corrode. The two merged, becoming one blade. Trash enchanting 8 greater than 12. Rhys blinked, then raised his brows. Oh, right. I already did that. Whoops. Guess my memory's a bit trash at times, too. He chuckled under his breath, then turned to the blade, taking a look at its new form. It looked like an ordinary sword, but he could feel the corrosive intent of the gas in the sickly, oil-slick-colored blade. He swung it, and it shifted, stretching out long and swinging around a nearby tree like a thing alive, like a fluid. I don't care what you're planning, standing still like that. You die here. A man shouted from behind him. Rhys flicked his wrist. The blade whipped back on itself and stabbed through the man's heart. The man's expression turned serious, and he pressed on, meaning to strike Rhys in the back with his dying blow. From the small wound on his chest, purple corruption ate into the man's flesh. It bit deeper and deeper, chewing into his pectorals, his ribs, his heart and lungs. His arteries and veins darkened, becoming black and purple lines in his flesh. His swing faltered as his chest caved in, and he dropped to the ground at Rhys's heels. The last dying echo of a Tier 3 mana signature wheezed from him as he died. Rhys turned at last. He looked at the sword, then at the man. Well, damn. They'd been in the woods all morning, waiting in their predetermined spots for the ambushes to show up. Most of them had thought it was somewhat stupid to try and enact an ambush, with no ability to disguise their auras, but when Madame Quast asked for an ambush, you complied. You didn't ask why or tell her she had a bad idea. Since she'd started following that sketchy alchemical manual, her power had skyrocketed, but her brainpower and sanity had plummeted. She'd transformed from the largely rational, if somewhat unnecessarily cruel Shinko Quast, to the aggressive and a little bit cuckoo Madame Quast. They all knew she was destined for a bad end, but until that day came, all they could do was grin and bear it. Hey, is Gus back yet? Didn't he say he was going to go deal with that kid? Tiana asked. No, I lost track of his signature a while back, Anders responded. That isn't good, Tiana muttered, looking around her. A dark shadow materialized behind her, holding a strange sword that wobbled on the wind. Tiana. He only had enough time to scream before the boy struck home, slamming the sword through Tiana's chest. Anders rushed forward, only for the sword to surge through her chest and seek him out, as though with a mind of its own. He threw himself backward and managed to dodge a center mass hit, though the sword scraped by his arm, leaving a purple-black mark behind it. The mark expanded, chewing a hole into his bicep. The young man flicked his sword, cutting it through Tiana's decaying body as much as sliding her off of it, and darted after Anders. He had enough time to raise his sword with his good hand before the blow landed, but to no avail. The young man's flexible sword bent around his blade and sought out his heart nonetheless. He felt the pain of corruption, and then nothing at all. Rhys looked at his new sword appraising Ly, constantly amazed at how good it was. It was making these battles with Tier 3s downright laughable. He knelt, absorbing the two newest victims before their energy could dissipate. The upside of an easy battle was that their bodies had more energy, since they had no time to expend their mana. He could easily re-core half the mages back home with this kind of energy, and maybe even look at upgrading a few of them, too, though he knew he'd be better off expanding his low-level mage base and training them a little, so he could offload more of his work. Rather than getting a few more Tier 2s, he needed to get Mouse and Lyra up to Tier 3, and maybe work on raising himself to Tier 4. Two signatures closed in on him. Rhys kicked off, dashing into the woods. Even if the new sword made things trivial, he wasn't going to stand around for other people to get an opening shot off on him. He had no illusions about his chances if the opponent got a shot off in whatever their path was. It would turn a trivial battle into a real battle and might even seriously wound him, neither of which he wanted to deal with when he had a battle with a Tier 4 on the horizon. That signature hadn't moved. For some reason, he wasn't sure whether to be worried, or laugh it off. On one hand, he didn't need to worry about her. He assumed the boss was the woman on the magical walkie-talkie, attacking while he was dealing with a bunch of Tier 3s at the same time. But on the other hand, she could very well be preparing a dangerous technique that took some time to activate, but which would OHKO him when it hit. He'd read enough trashy manga to know just how serious the boss not entering the battle until the very end could be. Let's finish this up quickly and go fight the boss. One way or another, the sooner he fought the boss, the better it would be for him, and for everyone else on his side, anyways. Fire raced through the trees. He jumped to the side, but it turned and chased after him, revealing the form of a rabbit composed of flames. The rabbit leapt at his chest, and he slashed into it, cutting it apart. The trash gas compressed into blade form on his sword ignited, exploding right in his face. He staggered back, surprised by his own attack, and the hilt fell to pieces in his hand. Rhys wiped his face free of soot and grimaced. If only fire could truly be something he could perfect counter. Gods, he wished. He was a perfect counter to some fire attacks, but that didn't mean that every fire in the universe bowed before his trash. And if he was doing something stupid, like compressing gas and then cutting fire with it, well, physics takes over. If he'd thought about it and smothered the rabbit with non-flammable poison gas, that would have been different, but he hadn't. Nor had he selected the gases in his sword for their flammability. He'd selected them their virility and corrupting properties, but more active and dangerous gases, poison, were often also highly flammable. Not always, and he definitely could have chosen dangerous non-flammable poisons, but he hadn't been fighting a flame user, so why would he think about it? With every passing day, I regret more that I once claimed myself a perfect counter to flame. It was like all the fire users of the world were coordinating to show him just how much of a perfect counter he wasn't, except half the time he was gotchaing himself. He's over there. Someone shouted. Yeah, Rhys muttered. He reached into his storage ring and withdrew a new broken sword, then recreated his sword, this time carefully selecting non-combustible gases that were still nice and poisonous. This version of his sword wouldn't be as disgustingly corruptive as the first, which was sad, but it still had the flexible and flowing properties of the first sword. Oh, well, I can always make a dangerous version for non-fire-based battles. The sky darkened overhead as a rock hurtled down on his position, chased by a dozen shining silvery blades. Rhys took off through the forest. That was enough sitting still. He had no desire to be a sitting duck for them to unleash all their fancy attacks onto. The rock smashed down behind him, throwing the earth up all around him. Trees toppled. The knives flew an uncanny path toward him, but even so, most of them were intercepted by the falling trees. Rhys deflected the rest, but he was forced to stand his ground and focus on the blades, and in that time, the 3 remaining Tier 3s arrived on his position. "Kill him," a burly woman shouted, yanking another unrealistically large chunk out of the earth and tossing it at Rhys. The second, a slender man in black, flicked his fingers, and the knives whirled to his side, flashing almost like fish in a school. He spun his hand, and they gathered into a dangerous group and flew at Rhys. The final of the 3, a girl with flaming bunny ears, made a bunny pose, and another fire rabbit leapt forth and charged at him. Well, Rhys looked at the 3 of them. Time seemed to slow. Which to target first? Knives guy was the most annoying, but also kind of the least problematic. He could take a few cuts without dying, and while he was locked down mobility-wise if he chose to deflect, he could also dodge. Fire Rabbit Girl was kind of weakened now that he had his less flammable sword, and he could always use some carbon dioxide to stifle her rabbits. Earth Girl was super strong, and would definitely be a pain to deal with, but right now, both of her hands were full. Snap decision. He charged at the Earth Wielder, dashing past the rabbit. The rain of knives slashed toward him, and he dropped low, skidding over the mossy ground, then hopped back up. The knives gave chase, but he was already too close. He struck home, piercing through the burly woman's ribs before she could throw the earthen chunk at him. The corruption and decay was slower, but it was still fast enough. She crumpled, and Rhys fled past her, letting the earth chunk fall down and pin a good number of knives to the ground. The rabbit leapt over the chunk of earth, but he had already reached the rabbit's caster. "You're a ranged fighter. What are you doing in melee range?" he asked her. Her expression turned fierce. She leapt up and kicked him in the face, and for a second, the world went fuzzy. Rhys shook his head. Question answered. She leapt again, preparing to kick a second time, but this time he was wise to her true power, and blocked with his blade instead. The edge nicked her skin, and corruption began to spread. She gritted her teeth and kicked again. This time, Rhys ducked away, dodging to the side. He grabbed a table fragment from his core and threw it behind him, activating Trash Intent just in time for the fire rabbit to bonk its head on the manifestation. Knives, too, struck into the manifested table. The rabbit girl pivoted and kicked again. He caught her leg and pushed impurities directly into it through skin-on-skin contact. She yelped and retreated, and the second she gave him room, he took her head with the sword. Knives guy's face crinkled in distaste. He swept his hand again, and a hail of blades chased after Rhys. Rhys ran, kiting the knives, and summoned a scrap of what had once been a tarp from his core. He stopped dead and held out the scrap. Seconds before the knives impacted him, he called forth the manifestation of the tarp and stretched it out. The knives slammed into the fabric and pierced half through it, but not all the way through with his magical reinforcement. He wrapped the tarp around the knives and spun it around, then slammed the lump of tarp-wrapped metal into the man's face. The man blinked, but took no real damage, since he still controlled the knives on the inside of the tarp, but that was fine. Rhys released the tarp and dashed in. His flexible sword lashed like a snake and cut the man's chest open. It wasn't enough to pierce him through, but the man must have had a weak constitution, because the poison immediately spread, darkening his veins and corrupting his body. He fell back, coughing a dark liquid, and went limp. Rhys flicked his sword and looked around. Seeing, and sensing, no one else, he slurped up all the bodies and power around him, and ran for the strongest signal in the distance, the one that hadn't moved since the start. I hope Mouse and Lyra are still okay. And still waiting, and not panicking that I haven't called back, he thought, as he closed in on the Tier 4. He'd really thought Walkie-Talkie Lady would be closer to the portal, but wisely, she'd been quite some distance from it. But now he'd cleared out the forest, and, from the familiar Tier 3 signature closing in on him from behind, Sable had dealt with her men, too. He turned his eyes ahead. One left. One last powerful core to add to his stores of power. He bounded through the forest, closing in on the Tier 4 signature. Sable caught up with him, clawing from tree to tree with her bonus limbs, and followed along, easily matching his pace. They cleared the forest without any further attacks and found themselves on a great plains. Semi-permanent huts and tents were arrayed over the plains, and from a quick scan, some Tier 1 immortal chaff was arrayed across the tents. Rhys made a mental note to double back and make sure no one was being held against their will, then maybe press gang them into service or steal their cores, but kept his eye on the prize. Right now, they needed to take down the Tier 4 more than anything. The Tier 4 signature emanated from a cave up ahead. He glanced at Sable, then gestured for her to fall back, remembering the aphrodisiac episode. If this person liked using potions and traps, then better that they went off on him than on Sable. He'd be able to laugh them off, but if Sable got caught up in the collateral or otherwise affected, he'd have to take a moment to clean the poison out of her, and if the Tier 4 was as ruthless as he suspected they were, he likely wouldn't get a chance until the end of the battle, or else they'd use it to land a heavy blow on him. Either way, it was a losing proposition for him, but a winning one if he went alone, so he walked ahead without her. For her part, Sable didn't complain. Either she understood or she didn't, but she was used to taking orders, and trusted him enough to listen to his. She stood silently in the background, folding her legs back under her cape while the wind flowed through her hair. Rhys stared at her for a moment, wishing he had a camera, then reluctantly turned away. Internally, he sighed. Damn, she looks so cool. He turned back around and headed toward the signature. Although he could sense the Tier 4 emanations from quite some distance, he couldn't actually see where they were coming from. As far as he could tell, he was walking toward a big earthen wall for no reason. He kept his head on a swivel, searching for traps both visually and with his mana senses. He stepped forward, and his foot sunk into gooey ground. Black gunk welled up around it, chewing at his flesh. He yelped and yanked his foot back, then paused. The poison ate at his body. It filled his blood with impurities and darkened his flesh in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. He hopped into the hole with both feet and let the mud close in around him. Poison ravaged his body. His flesh darkened, his veins streaked with purple-black bruises. He coughed and spat up dark fluid. This was worse than an impure well. Worse than any of the filth he'd found recently. This was poison, poison that was actively trying to kill him. It corroded him with intention, no, intent, destroying his body from the inside out. Poison intent. That was what it was. That was the difference between this filth and ordinary filth. This poison wasn't just passively deadly, but actively wanted to kill him. It devoured his body and surged into every dangerous kink and narrow point in his mana passages, actively trying to make his mana flow the wrong direction and tear him apart. But that only made it fantastic training. Rhys closed his eyes, focusing inward. Whenever the poison found a weak point, he immediately rushed there and used the poison's own impurities and corruptive influence to scour that weak point out of his body, then let the poison keep coursing through him. If he hadn't successfully fixed the weak point, then the poison went back to attacking it. If he had, then it flowed on, searching out the next weakness. Immersed in rebuilding and training himself, Rhys totally forgot about why he'd come here, his purpose, the fight, everything, and simply focused on improving himself. It had been too long since he'd had a good training session, and as if his body had been crying out for it, he lost himself to training. Ahead, the Tier 4 Poison Master, Madame Quast, cackled. You fool. Falling for my pitfall, you'll never escape. Corrode to death. Get poisoned until you're no more than a mere mortal. Let my most virulent poison scour your bones. In the field behind him, Sable crossed her arms and yawned, bored. She watched Rhys with a little confusion, then shook her head. That fool. Who are you? What are you doing here? She turned. A random Tier 1 man had approached from the tents, a sword leveled at her. She looked at him, then snapped her fingers. His sword shattered. He looked at it in shock, and when he looked back up, Sable was gone. She dashed through the woods, coming to Rhys's side, then stood there protectively. The Tier 4 presence hadn't moved yet, but if it attacked Rhys while he was training, he would probably be fine. Her bone limbs twitched under her cape. Truth be told, she just wanted a fight. She didn't think she could beat a Tier 4 yet, or else she would have charged in, but if the fight came to her, well, she wasn't going to turn it down. All at once, Rhys burst out of the poison pit. His eyes sparkled, and though his clothes were in tatters, he leapt forward, searching out the next pit. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see poison pits everywhere, just seething with delicious poison for him to slurp up and use for self-improvement. He raced into the next pit and leapt in head first. He hadn't submerged his head the first time. What if there were weaknesses in his head's mana flows, veins, and flesh? He'd never know. Sable sighed and followed after him. Madame Quast blinked. That person had neutralized her poison pit. And not only that, but his signature seemed stronger. That couldn't be right. Were her mana senses off again? Sometimes the fumes of her poisons could alter her perception. She waved her hand to see things clearer, as the signature toppled into another poison pit. She snorted under her breath. He was a fellow poison master, after all. She was confident in her pits, but she had to respect another master of the art. Perhaps he'd known a way to counter that particular poison, she'd allow that. But each pit held a different, horrifically virulent poison. There was no way he had the means, knowledge, or materials to counter every single one of her Tier 4 poison pits. And if he didn't fall into them, she could throw them at him. Submerged in the new pit, Rhys eagerly accepted the poison into his body. When it didn't seep into his pores fast enough, he opened his mouth and swallowed it down. That introduced the poison directly to his organs and digestive tract, which balked, and revealed critical weaknesses that Rhys hadn't yet shored up. The poison, too, surged toward his brain at the same time. 2 attacks on critical organs that he hadn't yet trained. Rhys grinned. That was twice the opportunities to discover how to shore up and strengthen his body. And, amazingly, he was surrounded by poison that gave him the materials to fix it, right here. The poison intent surged through him, seeking out more weaknesses, more, coursing deeper and deeper, and Rhys was right there the whole time, reinforcing his cells and organs with the converted poison. A little more. That stomach lining, right there, if I can, hey. Where's all the poison going? He looked around him, and realized he was lying at the bottom of an empty pit. Rhys jumped back to his feet and leapt out of this pit, sprinting over to the next pit as quickly as his legs could carry him. Sable jogged after him, half resigned, half amused. As long as she avoided the places Rhys was beelining to, it was shockingly easy to avoid all the pitfall traps, though she had to question the intelligence of a Tier 4 mage who relied on pitfalls. Tier 4 mages could fly. Did this one not know that? Madame Quast frowned. 1 was shocking enough, but 2. No, he was a poison master. She had underestimated him, but that was all. His luck would run out eventually, or he'd run out of alchemical agents to destroy her poisons, and then he would be no more than a sitting duck, ripe for the plucking. Another poison pit vanished from her perception. Then another, and another, and another. Just when she was sure she'd finally meet this towering master of the path of poisons, who had somehow surpassed even her, though he was only at Tier 3, the Tier 3 signature doubled back to slurp up some poison pits it hadn't fallen into, and not only that, but trigger a few of the gas traps she'd strung in the trees. Despite all that, she couldn't sense her poison in his veins for more than a few seconds, and his signature remained healthy and bright. There was a second signature, too, that hung back and stood to the side while the first one bounded from trap to trap, and at last, Madame Quast figured it out. The first one was a clone, or else some kind of sponging underling. It wasn't the real threat, but rather, some kind of complex decoy, or maybe even some kind of captured meat shield, who was holding some kind of disguise pendant and being forced to wipe out all the traps. Yes, now it made sense. She'd been foolish to worry about some overpowerful poison master and hide in her cave, when it was really all some kind of weak mental ploy. Angry at herself for falling for it, and annoyed at her opponent for resorting to such base tactics, Madame Quast snapped her fingers. 2 pots full of vile purple liquid had been snapping and bubbling next to her, but now, the liquid spun. It swirled faster and faster, becoming a whirlpool, then leaping out of the pot entirely as the 2 streams took on the shape of cobras. They flared their hoods at one another, then surged out of the cave and hurtled toward the 2 signatures outside. Madame Quast harumphed. Let's see what they make of that. Outside of the cave, Rhys sighed, a little sad. All the traps were gone. There wasn't any poison left to train with. And he'd been making such good progress. He didn't even have to feel guilty about it, because he was actively progressing toward his goals at the same time. It was such a good situation for him that he might just throw himself into the arms of his enemy when he finally came face to face with her and give her a big hug of gratitude. He couldn't have asked for better training. Just as he was reluctantly turning his feet toward the boss, 2 purple snakes lunged out of the earthen wall ahead. The earth hissed and blackened as they passed, and trees died, rotting as they fell, while plants withered directly into dust. His eyes widened, and he gasped. These were stronger than any of the pits or gas traps he'd encountered. These were strong enough to pose a serious threat to him. These were exactly what he needed to make the final fixes to his body. They surged toward Sable, perhaps because the Tier 4 had finally noticed that poison wasn't doing much to Rhys, but Rhys scoffed. He wasn't going to let training that good get away from him that easily. He jumped on the snakes, pulling them into his body with all his might. They struggled, trying to break free and attack Sable instead, but he refused to let them get past him. They were poison. Poison was trash. And trash belonged to Rhys. He couldn't fully suck them in, perhaps because of the poison intent that clung to their forms, making them slippery and hard for his mana to grip, but the snake projections had minds of their own, and they were angry. First one, then the other, whipped around and bit Rhys, pouring their poison into him. Yes, Rhys shouted, excited. More, all of them, into his body. Destroy him, so he could enhance himself. Sable chuckled under her breath and shook her head at him. Madman. The snakes, too, were sucked into the figure, and within the cave, Madame Quast frowned. If he was a weak damage sponge, faking his tear, he shouldn't have been able to do that. Or, was he some kind of doll or hollow figure, whose whole purpose was to absorb poison? No, that explained everything. How he'd so easily dispelled her aphrodisiac, how he could endlessly absorb her potion. He was a doll, like the straw man, but one that sucked up poison instead of curse energy. She cackled. Aside from the straw man, dolls were weak. They were easily destroyed, except by the one energy they were meant to absorb. All she had to do was attack him physically, and the true leader, that girl in black, would have no more defense against her poisons. Sweeping up some of her vials, she strode out of her cave. Her eyes fell upon her opponents, and she couldn't help but scoff aloud. A boy in ragged clothes and a girl in some outlandish black and bones outfit. What a joke. None of them were serious about Midge Hood, the way she was. Slurping down the last of the poison and taking the last steps at reinforcing his body, Rhys stopped dead, struck dumb. Purple. So much purple. Purple and neon green. He was pretty sure the woman's gown was meant to look sexy, but it just hurt his eyes to look at. And her skin was uncomfortably greenish pale, streaked with purple veins, and her hair was a shock of bright orange, blown out like some kind of Bride of Frankenstein costume from the 1930s. It wasn't natural orange, either, but highlighter orange. Painfully orange. Cheap Halloween store wig orange. Have some self-respect and buy your wigs online orange. It wasn't good. No part of it was good. Madame Quast snapped her whip. No further. You fools. You think you have overcome my poisons. Not yet. Hold on. Rhys focused inwardly for a moment. He squinted, concentrating, then sighed in relief. There. Poison overcome. She laughed. I wasn't speaking to you, doll. Rhys squinted at her. We don't know each other that well. That's sexual harassment. A mere object has no right to protest. I've seen through you. I know what you are. One strike from my whip, and you'll falter. Rhys blinked. He pointed at himself. Me. You. He frowned. I think you've misjudged me. I'm more of a step-on-me kind of guy. Whips are a little too extreme, you know. I don't want to actually get hurt. Of course you don't. You'll shatter. She turned to Sable. If you want to save your toy, retract it now, or else I'll break it for you. Sable shook her head. No. Rhys looked at Sable. What's going on? Does she think I'm your boy toy? He trailed off, not wanting to give voice to the horrific thought that had just struck him. Or is there a culture of enchanted sex dolls in this world, where the objects otherwise appear completely human, but are nothing but really nice dildos? He shuddered. And she thinks I'm one of them. Wait, hold on. Why is she so worried about removing me from the equation if I'm just a fancy sex doll? I'm so lost. Wait, Rhys eyed Madame Quast in a new light. She'd tried to inflict them with an aphrodisiac. She managed a brothel that was more of a swinger's hangout. She was dressed in some overly sexy outfit, even if he found the clashing colors incredibly unsexy. Could it be? Was she one of those trashy female villains, the kind who mostly showed up in only the most cursed fics, who fought by using sex? Whose entire battle tactics were based on seduction? They were more of a stallion novel trope than a Yuri trope, but if she wanted to engage in competitive scissoring with Sable, well, who was he to get in the way? Rhys shook his head. No. I don't think Sable is consenting to the competitive scissoring match, given the way she flatly refused to put me away earlier. Consent is always number one. If Sable doesn't want this kind of battle, then I'll stand up to this sexual harassment mage for her. He looked over his shoulder and gave Sable a thumbs up. I understand. I'm an ally. I'll take care of her for you. Sable blinked, completely lost. Rhys stepped forward. We don't consent. Fight me, fiend. Madame Quast laughed. You think you can take on Madame Quast? Foolish doll. Come here, and let Madame teach you your place. Tempting, but no. He drew his new less combustible poison sword, though he didn't have much hope in defeating her with it. She was a poison master, if her all-poison traps and attacks and her poison intent were any indicator, not to mention her poisonous to the eyes look. The flexible nature of the sword was worth more than the toxins imbued in it against another poison master. Even if she was more of an alchemical type, she'd still have at least a low-level invulnerability against poisons, which meant that his sword would be a debuff, but not the battle-deciding weapon it had been lately. No. His strongest weapon against this poison master would be his ability to absorb pretty much any poison she threw at him. Actually, he looked forward to it. He'd already improved this much. How much could he continue to improve, when she was actively throwing her worst at him, versus when he was passively absorbing her traps and distance attacks? He'd been foolish to fear her as the boss who was setting up in the background. He should have been excited about her being the boss who set up in the background. That meant stronger poisons for him to face, or in other words, more fodder for him to use for his own personal growth. She lashed her whip in place, meaning to intimidate him. Purple liquid oozed from within the braided steel coils, sizzling where it hit the ground. From where Rhys stood, he could taste the fumes, and his face stung from mere proximity to the whip. He licked his lips. Now this was going to be good training, indeed. And not like that, either. Fast as a snake, she struck. Rhys leapt forward and took the blow on his chest. Purple liquid seared through his shirt and into his skin. He lashed out and grabbed the whip, then sucked in powerfully. All the poison whirled into him, leaving nothing but a steel whip behind. Madame Quast gasped in shock. She stared at him. He might be the most powerful doll I've ever seen. Rhys staggered back, overwhelmed. The poison was the most vicious he'd ever encountered. It burned, searing through his veins. Weak spots. What were weak spots? This poison didn't need weak spots. It simply bit into what it wanted to bite, chewed through what it wanted to chew. He chased after it, desperately enhancing his flesh and patching his body back up, but it raged on. He couldn't absorb it into his trash, either. The poison intent was too strong, and made it slippery, something he couldn't grasp. Have I bitten off more than I can chew? Is this my final mistake? Rhys's will surged, and he beat back his own voice of doubt. No. He refused. He refused to buckle here, to some mere poison master's poison. No, that was his real mistake, wasn't it? He was still seeing it as poison. Still comprehending it as something beyond his power. But it wasn't. It wasn't beyond his power. It was poison, and poison was extracted from wounds. Neutralized. Removed. Thrown away. Poison, fundamentally, more truthfully than it was poison, was trash. The poison intent fought back. It was a tier 4 intent, nothing to shake a stick at, and he couldn't directly challenge it and win. It was more powerful than him. But right now, it was inside Rhys's body. Inside his trashy body, within his trashy blood, where his intent was the strongest. And not only that, but this, the material the intent was clinging to, was trash. Now that he had fundamentally rendered it trash rather than poison, the poison intent didn't have anything to stick to. It faded away, and he scrubbed the powerful poison into equally powerful mana, then fixed up and reinforced his body with it. His eyes opened, and he breathed out, more powerful than he'd been moments ago. Madame Quast gritted her teeth. What have you done? Do you have any more poison? I think I'm on the verge of a breakthrough, Rhys said with a smile. She pointed at Sable. Remove your doll from the battlefield this instant. Rhys squinted at her. I'm not a doll. I'm a human. Seriously. You are not. No human can survive Madame Quast's poisons, she insisted. He approached her. She lashed her whip, trying to snap it out of his hand, but he yanked it toward him instead. Stop getting lost in your delusions and fight me. Doll or not, I'm going to kill you. I have nothing. You've already overcome my strongest poison. Really? Rhys asked. She spread her hands. I forced my way to tier 4. I acknowledge that. I faced some drawbacks as a result. My physical might is lacking. If I cannot poison you, I cannot defeat you. Well, that's boring, Rhys said, crossing his arms. He sighed, then gestured. Come at me, then. Why? So you'll feel better than if you defeat an unresisting woman? She asked scathingly. The result is the same. Rhys thought for a second, then nodded. You know what? You're right. He dashed to her. In a split second, he broke her neck and absorbed her and her energy. He didn't need to be noble. He was trash. If his enemy wouldn't resist, then he'd go ahead and end them anyways. Plus, she'd done enough resistance already. It was just all poison, rather than aggressive attacks. If she'd used those attacks on anyone but him, she was right, they wouldn't have survived. She was built to be an underhanded fighter, who never engaged in actual battle. Was he meant to not kill her, because she wasn't good at melee combat and wouldn't fight him? Ridiculous. He nodded at Sable. That's that, I guess. I'm going to go grab the rest of the poisons and stuff in her cave, and then we can clear out the camp and head home. Sable nodded. She pointed at his chest. The voice sending enchantment. Oh, right. Rhys closed his eyes and groped around in his core for a bit before he plucked it back out. Mouse, Lyra, we're all good here. Are you all good back there? There was a pause, and then Mouse whispered, we're good, but hurry. Rhys and Sable exchanged a look, then sprinted in opposite directions, Sable to the portal, and Rhys toward the cave. Sable skidded to a halt. She looked back. I'll just be a second. This stuff is super valuable. Rhys called, hurtling into the cave Madame Quast had been using. He couldn't let all that delicious poison go to waste. It only took Rhys a few moments to clear out the cave, mostly because he stood in the middle of it and sucked it all into his core like he was a giant vacuum. He could sort the contents out later, when his friends weren't in danger. There wasn't much they could do about the camp. With the call from Mouse, they had to rush back. At least they could always step back through the portal after they figured out whatever was going on with Mouse, but first, they needed to sort out whatever was happening with her and Lyra. Rhys had kept the magical walkie-talkie in his pocket, but since their first interaction, Mouse hadn't spoken again. He didn't know if she was in a place where she could talk, or if she'd had to strain her invisibility to its utmost to say anything, so he just waited for her to speak, and otherwise remained silent. Man, Lyra and Mouse are always getting into trouble, he thought, shaking his head. Whenever he sent the two of them on their own, bad things happened. He had to send them with someone else, or at least not send the two of them together. Then again, was it that they got into danger, or that Mouse could hide from danger rather than fight her way out, and preferred the former to the latter? He didn't get it, and he didn't think Sable got it, either, but it was definitely Mouse's way. Lyra would rather fight, but, if she wasn't near water, she wasn't super strong. It was the classic water-based character problem. Like the early Justice Club comics, where Water Guy was useless until someone tossed a bucketful at him. Lyra was better than Water Guy, but she still had some of the drawbacks. While she would do incredible in water-based combat, he was sure she would be at the exact same disadvantage Rhys would be at, if he had to fight in water. He couldn't even fault her for being good at water. If this world was anything like his, then it was majority water, and she had, in fact, made the right decision proportionally speaking. It was just that she was hanging with humans, and humans loved land, so she ended up in the wrong environment most of the time. What is going on with Lyra and humanity, anyways? Why isn't she hanging out with water sprites? I've been kind of ignoring the obvious, since she doesn't seem to want to talk about it, but I should ask, sometime. Probably at the least stressful or emotionally charged moment possible, since that seems like it might be a stressful or emotionally charged kind of conversation. Then again, who knew? She might just get sassy and be totally fine. He snorted to himself. She'd be getting sassy either way, really. They rushed to the portal and jumped through into an empty room. Rhys looked around, searching for the signs of a struggle, but there were none. He frowned slightly, glancing at Sable, who shrugged. As they stepped outside, something snagged at Rhys's trousers. He jumped and whirled, drawing his poisoned sword, and finally caught sight of his assailant, Mouse. She gave him a desperate look. "Are you done? Can we go?" Yeah, but," Rhys looked around. "Weren't you in danger?" "No. I'm just so tired of this place." Beside Rhys, Sable started chuckling. Rhys rounded on her. "Don't you start. You thought she was in danger, too." Mouse blushed furiously. I didn't mean to, I'm sorry. I didn't consider that why you had to, just recently, me and Lyra." It's fine, Rhys said, waving his hand. Now that he was thinking about it, she had said, "We're good, but hurry." Nothing about being in danger. He was the one who'd assumed there was something wrong, and, well, he knew full well what they said about people who assumed things. He sighed. "If you want to leave, we can all go to the other side of the portal, now. There's no longer any danger. I could have called you and Lyra over much earlier, but I didn't have the messaging charm." Mouse nodded eagerly. "Speaking of, where's Lyra?" "She's, Mouse coughed. "Right here. We going?" Lyra asked. Rhys turned. She looked about the same as ever, except she was oddly out of breath and a little bit more flushed than usual. He squinted, but then decided that he didn't want to know, and just gestured. "Come on. It's safe on the far side of the portal, in all kinds of ways. Let's go." Relieved, Mouse all but sprinted to the portal room and jumped through. Shaking his head, Rhys followed after. Lyra glanced at Sable. "You know, you and me, we could, I dunno, take a little time to find the portal." "Why?" Sable asked, and stepped through. "Did I miss the read on that?" "Oh well." Lyra pulled up the rear and followed the rest through. There really wasn't much left to do on the far side of the portal. Rhys walked through the camp, the girls in tow. Anyone who attacked him or the girls, he slayed and absorbed. Those who didn't, were given a bold new opportunity for personal growth and customer engagement by getting placed at an exciting all-organic farm, or, in less corporate words, they were recruited. The mortals were mostly family members and children, and while some of them would be getting bereavement bonuses, they were all peacefully recruited, as mortals who clung to the edge of the magic world, they understood that there was nothing they could do, and that it was better to go with the flow and continue to receive the benefits of being associated with mages rather than often return to their mortal lives. All except one, that is. Come, join me. Exciting new employment opportunities await. Rhys called, walking through the end of the camp. Sudden motion from between two tents. He turned, reaching for his sword, but then laughed to himself. It was just a boy, a mortal boy. Rhys's reflexes were so fast that he'd turned and identified the danger between when the boy's foot had lifted off the ground, and when it touched down to propel him forward to his next step, so he had plenty of time to decide what to do. The boy had a knife, but it was mortal, and his whole body, strength, everything, it was all mortal. He waited, letting the boy close in, then gently turned him aside, very careful with his strength. He could accidentally kill tier 1s now, let alone mortals. The boy rounded on him, raising his sword again. He struggled to heft it, probably only 8 or so years old. You killed Dad. I'll kill you. He sighed. Lost child on aisle 5. Anyone lose a child? The adults around glanced at one another, then shook their heads. The boy's eyes glittered with tears. Dad was the only one left. And you killed him. Oh. Well, that's a problem. Anyone want to take on a child? One of the older women in the camp, probably mid-40s, but old for a mortal and wrinkled beyond her age, hurried forward and caught the boy by his arm, dragging him back. I'm so sorry about my brother. I'll keep him out of trouble. Forgive us, Lord Mage. Rhys raised his brows. That's an age gap. If the boy was right and Rhys had killed their father, then he was probably a mage, which certainly explained how these two could be siblings. He pulled a face internally. The children of mages were almost always mages. Mages rarely produced children, but when they did, to produce two non-mages would be unthinkable, unless the other parent was mortal. Which meant this mage had been wandering around, spreading his wild oats amongst random mortal women. He wasn't really sure why, but the idea disgusted him. Maybe because a 100-year-old grandpa who looks 20-something screwing mortal women who are actually 20 isn't illegal, but it's morally gross. Some guy deceiving mortal women with his immortal youth, it wasn't a crime, for sure, but he didn't like it. Of course, it was possible that he'd been completely open with the women about his age and status, and they'd done it anyways because of the overwhelming power and wealth associated with mages, but the whole situation kind of felt like 19-year-old boys fraternizing with 17-year-old girls who were still in high school. Nothing illegal about it, as long as they'd started associating before the boy turned 18, but there was a clear imbalanced power relationship between a high schooler living at home with no job, and a graduate with a job, money, and everything that came with it. It felt squicky, to put it short, and even if it wasn't wrong, in the eyes of the law, Rhys was sure he didn't like it. Of course, telling the kid that his father was kind of a scumbag wouldn't stop the rage in the boy's eyes, even if Rhys was more worried about accidentally killing the kid than the kid injuring him. It was a bad situation, and there was nothing he could do about it. He didn't regret his actions, but he had to admit that there were definitely downsides to killing people. He nodded at the woman. Please raise him well. The woman said nothing, but bowed low, forcing the boy to bow as well with a hand on his back. I'll kill you one day. I will. The boy shouted. The woman started and jumped to cover the boy's mouth, but Rhys just chuckled. Hold on to that anger. With that, he swept away coolly, looking totally awesome. Hell yeah. That situation sucked in all kinds of ways, but at least I got to deliver one of those, every weeb wants to say them once in his life, lines. And hey, if the boy grows up to be a mage and comes after me, that'll light a fire under my rear to keep moving upward. He nodded to himself, at least satisfied with his actions, if not necessarily satisfied by the concept of having accidentally orphaned a child. At the end of the day, every fighter knew what the options were. You didn't pick up a weapon without acknowledging that your opponent did as well, and you both fought with the intent to kill. That man had fought, intending to kill Rhys, and failed. This was the result of his failure. If he'd wanted to raise that boy well and not die, he wouldn't have entered battle. It was a bit victim blaming of him, but he didn't feel that guilty about it. Bad for the boy, sure, but guilty, not so much. He sighed wistfully. I guess I'm just too trashy. Too willing to accept the world as it was, rather than grandly dreaming that he might be able to change it one day. Nothing he could do about that. Hey, what happened to our crier? Lyra asked, stepping out of the tents ahead of him. I was having a moment of emotional growth and reflection as a person, Rhys informed her. Yeah, and what did you learn? He shrugged. Not much, honestly. Right, so back to crying, she said, smacking his shoulder. Yes, ma'am. Once the camp had been sorted, Rhys led their new recruits back home. There were too many to teleport, and anyways, he wanted to keep that kind of on the down low, if at all possible, so they had to take things the slow way. Rhys had more important things to do than cart a campful of mortals across the country, so after he helped ferry everyone through the portal, he left the rest of it up to Lyra, who was uniquely skilled at managing, acquiring, and handling water-based transport. He hadn't wanted to traumatize any more children more than was absolutely necessary, so he sent Sable through to shut things down beforehand. He only saw the aftermath, but the torn curtains and slashed walls told him enough about how she cleared a room. To be honest, he had kind of expected a little bit of violence, but Sable seemed to have immediately reverted to ultra-violence, not that he was really complaining. The fewer people who saw them moving massive quantities of Empire citizens around the map, the better. This operation wasn't going to be possible to keep quiet, so rather than send them to an existing farm or integrate them openly into his operation, he had Lyra take them to a midpoint in the Empire, out into a big chunk of empty land where they could start a new farm without too much scrutiny. His further flung shops needed fresh food, and the logistics had been getting complicated, but if he had a new farm supplying them with local food, then he'd both minimize the chances that this large operating getting busted would bring him down, and requisition supplies closer to the point of sale, meaning fresher food for his customers. Not that he cared that much about improving the quality of his food, but it was a nice side effect. It also wasn't that different a mode of functioning than he'd been doing already, with his distributed, criminal-run farms. It was just that this one was further from his base, and also bigger than usual. Plus, it wasn't as if the Empire could complain too much about a new farm opening up on unused land. As far as they knew, these were just some aspiring potato farmers. Sure, aspiring potato farmers being led by their water sprite prophet to the promised farm, but hey. What kind of place didn't have a few wandering, iterant farmers being led by random prophets, right? He snorted to himself. At this point, people are actually going to start worshipping me as a god. That absolute existence fellow might have made a mistake, but Rhys was rapidly approaching at least worship-based, in the eyes of mortals godhood. He was hitting all the classic notes, rescuing people from horrible situations, teaching new technology to those who had never had it before, aka teaching the animals to farm, leading large groups of people across vast distances to new, better employment. Well, some of those are also the hallmarks of a criminal or resistance organization, so I can't ascend to godhood that quickly, Rhys thought, shaking his head. It had been a joke from the start. He wasn't even close to being a god. The Empress was far closer, what with her higher rank and nation's worth of devoted believers, and she was still considered a good ways from true godhood by most mages. He didn't have the time to check in on them, when he had to teleport around to all his stores, keeping them refreshed with vats of impurities to drizzle in the food. He had at least made a mild improvement in his impurity imbuement, where at first, he'd had to manually imbue all the food with trace impurities. Now, he made a concentrated impurity potion, though not too concentrated, and passed around instructions on how to mix it into the oil and salt for potatoes, into the soda/coffee, and so on. Well, to be fair, he now had a full set of competent soda makers, so long as he continued to supply impurities, and they were beginning to train the second generation of soda makers. It was hard to run all the shops and supply their critical materials now that they were growing so numerous and so distributed. He really couldn't take a break. Every waking moment, which was all of them, he had to devote to running the stores. He couldn't take on much more, they were reaching critical mass. Any more than this, and he'd have to find someone else with the path of trash who could make the impurity potions, or maybe just find a really bad alchemist. Most alchemists tried to avoid impurities. After all, it would take a really shit one to make a whole potion out of impurities and nothing else. He managed to record all the mages he'd rescued from the last raid with the energy he'd grabbed from the camp. The Tier 4, Madame Quast, alone record a good 5 or 6 of them. They'd been gazing at their friends with jealousy, and at him with dark eyes, but as he successfully kept his promise, their eyes lightened, and their gazes turned worshipful. Rhys smiled with benevolence the whole time, while internally, he wondered how close he'd been to a mutiny. If he hadn't cleared the camp, how many more months, weeks, days would he have had, before the will of the people usurped the will of their leader? As a leader of his own resistance organization, he had to respect the spirit of the mutiny, even if he didn't agree with their impending actions. Luckily, he'd nipped their mutiny in the bud by holding up his promises, unlike most politicians, but if he hadn't, he didn't even want to imagine the potential damage a rogue member of his crew could do. Just reporting them to any of the Empire's military could take the secret right out of their secret resistance, let alone if they tried to remove one of the key players, or reveal Rhys's bases. Most of the little guys didn't know the true extent of Rhys's network, but they could still do massive damage revealing any piece of it. There was no two ways about it, and no real way to minimize the potential damage except what he'd already done. At the end of the day, if he was going to have people, he had to keep them happy. That was just what being a leader was all about. And it wasn't something he was particularly good at. He sighed aloud. When this is all done, I'm going to run into the woods and go be a hermit for a while. Stop worrying about people altogether. Back at his home base, he paused, gripping the edges of an impurity potion. Was this it? Was this endgame? He didn't want to conquer the whole empire, just take back what they'd taken, and he'd already surpassed that goal by now, and spread his shops into the empire itself. True, he did need to poison the empire to achieve his goal, since the empire wouldn't just fight back with the soldiers who lived in the conquered region, but 1, he couldn't realistically poison the whole empire, and 2, he was rapidly reaching capacity. No, he'd say he was already over capacity. It was exhausting. He was exhausted. The poison swirled before him, and he gazed into it, searching for the answer. What was his goal? What was he trying to achieve? Overthrowing the empire, yes. He knew that. But to what end? To what distance? When did he pull the trigger? How would he know when it was time to pull the trigger? Did he do it now, because he was overloaded? Did he do it later, and continue at capacity for a time now, to ensure the maximum amount of the empire got poisoned? Did he do it after the next big raid on the camps, when he had the maximum soldiers under his control? He bowed his head. It was hard. Harder than he'd thought. Harder than he'd ever considered possible. Leading wasn't easy, and it wasn't for the faint of heart. He was just some piece of trash. He wasn't used to making hard decisions, and deciding the fate of everyone in the room. Because, at the end of the day, the second he pulled the trigger, he took responsibility for the lives of everyone he asked to fight by his side. This was his battle. This was the war he'd chosen to fight, when everyone else had run. In a certain light, any bloodshed that spilled from his battle with the Empress was on his hands and his alone. After all, everyone, the Alliance, its sword saint, everyone except for Rhys had decided to give up. To cede their land to the Empire and be done with it. It was only Rhys who'd said no. Who decided that the fight was worth it. Their land was worth it. The lives of the people in the camps were worth it. Was he right? Was he wrong? Did it matter, when people would die because he had chosen not to walk away? But was he wrong, for not capitulating? Was he wrong, for standing and fighting for what he believed in? For standing up for the underdog, instead of peacefully giving in to the Empire's bullying demands? He didn't think so. He didn't really care, to be honest. He'd decided to fight this war, so he would. But the lives of others, he couldn't just call them trash and throw them away. That boy, the one who'd vowed revenge, his eyes haunted Rhys. How many more would rightfully be able to demand Rhys stand and fight, face them for their revenge, before this was over? How many more on his side, and how many, many more on the Empire's? It was too late for regrets. Not that they were really regrets. He didn't know what to feel, or how to express what he was feeling. He guessed the closest thing was acknowledging his wrongdoing, yet still being resolved in achieving his goals. A second later, his eyes lit up. No, wait, I know what this is. This was the villain's monologue. That one scene late in the manga where the villain talked about how much death he'd caused with regret, as if he'd cared at any other point in the series, then told the reader that his goals were all worth it and carried on, ignoring all the moral implications anyways. He nodded. So I should also ignore the moral implications and carry on. Or, wait, maybe I shouldn't use the villains as a model for my own personal growth. He pushed up off the edge of the poison barrel, and a blade pushed into his throat. Rhys instantly put his hands up as a rough hand gripped his head, locking him against the blade. One move, and you die. You're going to stand there and listen to what I say, and when I'm done, this never happened. Rhys frowned. He knew that voice. Bast. There was a long pause. Rhys felt the man's grip tighten on his head, and then he spoke. Rhys. Bast. It is you. Yeah, it's me. The grip on his head didn't loosen. Prove it. Rhys called out to the poison before him and manipulated it into a droplet, hovering it over the barrel. How about that? You only proved you're a poison master. He sighed. When we were little, just after Straw took us in, you ate a bunch of meat pies that were only a little expired, according to you, but they were more than a little expired, and spent the entire afternoon crouching in the forest, shitting your brains out. I had to go snitch a pair of underwear from the house nearby, and Straw caught me stealing undies off the line. I took the fall for that, even though it was all your fault, and spent the whole evening doing push-ups while you. The hand released him and gave him a little push. Fine, I believe you. Rhys turned, already smiling. It's good to see you, too, Bast. His old friend stood behind him, his hands on his hips. He had a stern expression on his face, but cracked into a grin. You're doing far better than I expected. I thought I'd have to rescue you from one of the Empire's camps. Oh, did you? I'm no maiden. I rescued myself, he said, thumping his chest. He looked Bast up and down. You're doing pretty well for yourself, too. Bast was in great shape. Better than Rhys had ever seen him. He was wearing loose white robes that hid his true musculature, but it was impossible to hide the cut of his body. Rhys felt absolutely flabby in comparison, and he was no slouch. He'd grown taller, but so had Bast, and between the two of them, Bast was winning the height game. Not only that, but his abilities had grown, too. Bast was at least tier 3, and from the feel of it, he was on the verge of tier 4. And that wasn't the only indication. Sweat dropped down Rhys's back, and he swallowed, fighting back the urge to edge away. Just looking at Bast, standing his close to him, he felt as though he were in danger. As if, despite the man's relaxed stance and the sword he was in the act of sheathing, he were still holding a blade to Rhys's neck. Bast's aura was sharp as a sword, and Rhys's skin prickled at being this close to it. I see the Sword Saint is training you well, Rhys commented approvingly. It's been almost 4 years. I would hope I'd improved a little, Bast replied. He gestured at Rhys. You, too. I feel like I'm going to puke just standing this close. Is that a compliment? Rhys asked, giving him a skeptical eyebrow. I dunno. You tell me, Poison Master. Rhys laughed aloud, and a beat later, Bast started laughing. He clapped Bast's shoulder, shaking his head. It's been too long, man. Way too long. I agree. I thought you were dead. Glad you aren't. Couldn't put it better myself. Rhys crossed his arms, then looked Bast up and down. So what are you doing here? Given that you didn't even know I was me until a minute ago, I'm guessing this isn't a friendly visit. It's not an unfriendly visit. Bast leaned against a nearby wall and crossed his feet. He nodded at Rhys. The Alliance has picked up news about your little resistance. A few of the people you freed ran for the border. They all lacked cores, so they slid by without attracting the attention of the guards. The guards just assumed they were mortal traitors. On the other side, they ran for us and told us about the savior who was going around freeing people from prison camps. I guess that's me, Rhys said, scratching the back of his head. Bast snorted, giving Rhys an appraising look. They said something else, too. Some nonsense about their leader being able to recreate cores. Oh, yeah, I can do that, Rhys said. Bast raised his brow. How? It's complicated. That brow stayed raised. Rhys sighed. He held up his hand and pulled a ball of energy from his core. He didn't bother to form a whole core, since there was no purpose, and he needed to use energy himself, but he let it get close enough for Bast to understand the process, then absorb the energy back into himself. Like that. I'd ask how, but I can already tell I wouldn't understand. If it wasn't you, I wouldn't believe you, even seeing what you just did. It is pretty unbelievable, Rhys admitted. Bast nodded at him. Is that how you escaped your camp? Kind of, let me explain. He took a few minutes and explained to Bast everything that had happened when he'd escaped, the abridged version, anyways, without wasting any words he didn't need to. The suffering part was pretty irrelevant to Bast's understanding of the scenario, anyways, and it didn't make him sound very cool, either. When he finished, Bast squinted at him. How? What? How did you absorb impurities without a core? How did you, what did you say you did? Ignite trash into mana, that's not possible, Rhys. Rhys shrugged. I dunno. I did it, so it's possible. Bast opened his mouth, then shut it. He shook his head. People call me the prodigy of a generation, but I'm nothing compared to you. You're the prodigy of 1,000 generations. Don't be ridiculous. I'm just a trash talent scrabbling along by the skin of my teeth. You're the one with real talent here, Rhys immediately protested. Bast shook his head and said nothing. What about you, though? What have you spent the last few years doing? Rhys asked, looking him up and down again. Besides training every single muscle individually, damn. I didn't even know it was possible to get that ripped. Bast chuckled. After a second, he nodded. I've been training. A lot. I picked up on that, yeah. The Sword Saint was dispatched to the northern border to deal with the beasts encroaching from the north. There's a much more powerful region north of us, so when the monsters and beasts stampede from that direction, the Sword Saint is the only one who can deal with it. Of course, this time, it was a ploy by the Empire, but you know that. Rhys nodded. He did. But ploy or no, we still had to fight back the beasts, or else the entire alliance would be overrun before long. It was excellent training, endlessly fighting beasts in the snow, all while the Sword Saint corrected my form and showed me new techniques. I couldn't ask for better training. Rhys nodded sagely. Sounds like hell. It sure was. It sure was. Not as hellish as what you went through, I'm sure. Oh stop. It's not a competition. We both suffered. Bast gave him a look. Rhys broke into a grin. But I suffered more. Yeah. Bast rolled his eyes, and Rhys grinned even wider. As Rhys stopped laughing, Bast sighed and ran a hand through his hair. And when we were done, the Alliance finally got back in touch with us. They've been planning a counterattack this whole time, building up their forces and massing all the most powerful experts the Alliance has to offer, but they couldn't move until the Sword Saint was no longer indisposed. But the beasts are gone now. Rhys's eyes widened. And you were sent here to see if the resistance force was interested in taking part in the counterattack. He nodded. So, are you? Rhys shook his head. You have no idea. I've been agonizing over when I should launch my strike. I've got a lot planned, but it's not enough on its own. I was thinking I could maybe cause enough chaos to claw back some of our land, maybe enough to free the remaining camps, but if there's a serious counterattack, that changes everything. This is the best news I could have hoped for. I'm glad you're so enthusiastic, Bast said, crossing his arms. He shook his head. I was worried I'd be dealing with some irritating insurgent with impossible demands. What? I'm not irritating. How dare you? And I can come up with some impossible demands if you like. No, that's fine. Rhys looked around, then paused. Come to think of it, Corey was here with me. And Lyra. What happened to them? Bast looked aside. Bast. I just knocked them out. Like we used to do with that mouse girl. Don't worry. Rhys let out a relieved sigh. It wasn't like Bast wasn't a killer. Of course, he was trying to work with the insurgent, aka Rhys, so it wouldn't make sense if he'd killed the insurgent, aka Rhys' underlings, but he couldn't help but worry. He waved his hand, pushing his worried away. I'll cooperate. You can tell your higher-ups that. Just tell me the date, and I'll be ready to go. Bast nodded. He turned to go. Come on. You aren't even going to stay for a drink? Rhys asked. Looking over his shoulder, Bast eyed the bubbling purple vat behind Rhys. I'm good. I can get some good alcohol. I'm rich, Bast. I can afford the good stuff. Bast smiled. I'm tempted, but I shouldn't stay. I was never here, you know. Reluctantly, Rhys nodded. He understood. He didn't like it, but he did understand. Bast was sneaking into the Empire. He couldn't take that kind of risk. Hell, Rhys couldn't really afford the risk of being seen with Bast, a known member of the Alliance. It was risky for both of them, and with a counterattack close at hand, they could afford being found even less so. I'll see you soon, then, he said. Bast smiled. Yeah, soon. With that, he backed out of the room and vanished into the night. Now that he knew there was a counterattack on its way, Rhys couldn't help but be on edge. He spent the entire next day checking over his shoulder, as if the counterattack would start at any moment. What are you doing? Lyra asked, as he looked around him for the 1000th time that day. Rhys shut his mouth. He shouldn't say. Bast had knocked out everyone to tell him. It was clearly meant to be secret, or something like that. You're tired. I need a break. Lyra snorted. I can see that. Are you tired to the point of paranoia, though? Is that why you're looking around like that? I dunno. I think I'm just tired, Rhys excused himself. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to forcibly reset his mental state. Stop looking around. You're being obvious. Besides, it wasn't like the counterattack was going to happen today. Or tomorrow. Or the next day. It was probably weeks away. If he got all worked up for it now, he'd just exhaust himself long before the actual counterattack took place. Right now, he needed to invest. Invest in himself, invest in his restaurant, and invest in his underlings. Invest as if the sky was going to fall tomorrow, as if this was the last chance he'd get to grind before the final boss. He didn't know how long he had, but he had a little time, so he might as well use it to the best of his abilities. But how? He could always go seek out a few more impure wells, but that would only be a top-up on the trash tank at this point. Not that he wasn't going to do that, but it didn't seem like something to plan for, just something to pick up along the way. He could look for straw some more, but at this point, he was pretty sure the guy was majority in the Alliance. The little straw effigy had laid mostly dormant, though it had mysteriously appeared on the hilt of his new sword every time he'd thrown away his old sword. Probably something to do with Straw being massively cursed, if he had to guess. Ernesto was still his best lead, and Ernesto was not in the Empire. Or if he was hidden away somewhere, and Rhys didn't have the time to find him. It was, unfortunately, looking like finding Straw was still a future endeavor. Finalize the shops. But the shops were already at capacity. Or rather, Rhys was at capacity, so he couldn't realistically expand the shops any further. He could try teaching people his path, but he doubted people would be interested in picking up a trash path if they could pick up anything else. Also, he kind of didn't want to. Call it selfish and trashy of him, but it was a massive benefit to be the only one who was basically immune to impurities. If he made a student, and that student went rogue and they'd be a trashy student, so why wouldn't they do something trashy like decide to kill their teacher? Then he'd be the one in the most trouble. True, in this hypothetical scenario, he'd be much stronger than his student, but that was assuming things went as normal. He was a trash talent, though. If he trained a star talent, he didn't even want to imagine how powerful they could become, or how rapidly they could gain power. Anyways, his anxiety-fueled spirals aside, it would take years for someone to accumulate enough knowledge of trash to replace or even augment Rhys, so that wasn't an option with a counterattack around the corner. And anything else, expanding further wasn't really an option, and they were already as virulent as he could make them without risking getting caught as impure by every mage with half an iota of sense. The shops were in their final state. No, they weren't across the entire empire, and no, they weren't as epidemic as they could be, but they stretched a good distance into the empire, and they were as viral as he could make them. All he could do was his best, and when it came to the shops, he was comfortable saying he'd done his best. He could grow his underlings, but growing mages was a long, slow process. He'd record them all with the energy from the criminals, and more than that. Reaching Tier 2. Not realistic. Even the first ones who had joined his group hadn't reached Tier 2 yet. Even his Tier 2s were struggling to reach Tier 3, and they hadn't been recorded and had a long time to practice their paths outside of the time they'd spent in the Empire. Though, speaking of, the looks in the eyes of some of those rescued mages when he'd finally record them. He hadn't realized how close he was to mutiny. True, seeing their friends run around with cores and use magic while they were growing older as mortals couldn't be fun, and he understood that, but from the way some of them had eyed him on return, boy, they'd been closer to their absolute limit than he'd realized. It was fortunate that between the criminals and the Tier 4 he'd absorbed, he'd been able to recore all of them, or else he might not have had many underlings left. Not to mention the damage they could do, if they got frustrated and decided to go talk to the Empire. He couldn't imagine. They couldn't delete his entire operation, but they could do massive damage to him, and in the worst case, force him to activate his impurities before he was ready. People are dangerous, he thought to himself, shaking his head. When this was all done, he might just hare off into the wilderness and be a hermit for a while. Just spend some time on his lonesome, where there weren't any politics or interpersonal dynamics to deal with. He was someone who'd spent his entire life working from home because office politics sounded like hell. Having to deal with people now was basically his worst nightmare, except that the Empire had introduced an entire new dynamic of nightmare that he hadn't previously anticipated. He could raid more camps, but most of the camps had already been raided, and the ones that remained were deep in the heart of the Empire, even deeper than his shops could reach. He hadn't rescued everyone from his region, he didn't think, anyways, but after his big raid, the Empire had closed those camps and moved all the remaining workers and guards, the few there were, after Rhys's raids into the deeper camps. There was nothing he could do about that, not without overextending, nor did he want to create a big fuss on the eve of a counterattack. If all went well, the Empire might not exist after their counterattack, or at worst, it would exist in a weakened state, on a path toward death, and it would be easier to attack the camps after their counterattack. What else? He frowned, thinking, and then snapped, his eyes widening. The Empire's trash heaps. Its juicy trash heaps full of artifacts that were perfectly functional, but which the Empire simply disagreed with. It was time for him to go find those trash heaps, and raid the hell out of them. He barely needed to consult his longtime Empire citizens, aka the ex-criminals, to find out where they were. It turned out they were a well-known location, somewhere the entire Empire knew about, and highly, highly guarded. It was still a trash heap of sorts, but there were guards all around it, because the Empire disagreed with the artifacts, and wanted the world to know that, but knew that they were valuable to non-Empire citizens and didn't want to give their enemies easy power. Apparently, the mana battery that Logan Waters had been using came from the heap. The problem, however, was that the heap was well known by the Empire's citizens because everyone knew it was full of valuable artifacts, the Empire, its criminal elements, outside mages, everyone. As a result, the Empire guarded its heap well. Guards patrolled it 24/7, and not weakling Tier 1 guards, either, but Tier 2s, 3s, and 4s. It would be the hardest heist he'd done so far, harder than all the camps combined, harder, even, than raiding the criminals. His eyes glittered. He grinned. But I'm up for a challenge. And if all goes right, it might even be the kind of challenge where I end up getting stronger, and maybe Lyra and Mouse too, if we're lucky. And so, Rhys set his sights, at last, on the garbage heap full of powerful artifacts from the Empire's conquest. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.